Tonight, the topic we explore is the life of Queen Elizabeth I. The woman who defied marriage, ruled with unmatched resolve, and gave her name to an entire era. From the shadow of execution as a princess to the golden light of triumph as a queen, her reign reshaped England forever. A ruler, a symbol, and a mystery. Elizabeth I stands among the most iconic monarchs in history. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel only if you enjoy our content. And let us know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Sometimes the stories we tell are so interesting that they keep us up. And other times we're working on some boring ones for just that reason. Now it's time to dim the lights, turn on a fan for some soft white noise, and join us as we gently unfold the life, loves, and legacies of the Virgin Queen. Elizabeth I, the last Tudor monarch, was born at Greenwich on September 7, 1533, the daughter of Henry VIII and his second wife, Anne Boleyn. Her early life was full of uncertainties, and her chances of succeeding to the throne seemed very slight once her half-brother Edward was born in 1537. She was then third in line behind her Roman Catholic half-sister, Princess Mary. Roman Catholics, indeed, always considered her illegitimate, and she only narrowly escaped execution in the wake of a failed rebellion against Queen Mary in 1554. Elizabeth succeeded to the throne on her half-sister's death in November 1558. She was very well educated, fluent in 5 languages, and had inherited intelligence, determination and shrewdness from both parents. Her 45-year reign is generally considered one of the most glorious in English history. During it a secure Church of England was established. Its doctrines were laid down in the 39 Articles of 1563, a compromise between Roman Catholicism and Protestantism. Elizabeth herself refused to make windows into men's souls. There is only one Jesus Christ and all the rest is a dispute over trifles. She asked for outward uniformity. Most of her subjects accepted the compromise as the basis of their faith, and her church settlement probably saved England from religious wars like those which France suffered in the second half of the 16th century. Although autocratic and capricious, Elizabeth had astute political judgment and chose her ministers well. These included William Cecil, later Lord Burleigh, Secretary of State, Sir Christopher Hatton, Lord Chancellor, and Sir Francis Walsingham, in charge of intelligence and also as Secretary of State. Overall, Elizabeth's administration consisted of some 600 officials administering the great offices of state, and a similar number dealing with the crown lands, which funded the administrative costs. Social and economic regulation and law and order remained in the hands of the sheriffs at local level, supported by unpaid justices of the peace. Elizabeth's reign also saw many brave voyages of discovery, including those of Francis Drake, Walter Raleigh and Humphrey Gilbert, particularly to the Americas. These expeditions prepared England for an age of colonization and trade expansion, which Elizabeth herself recognized by establishing the East India Company at the very end of 1599. The arts flourished during Elizabeth's reign. Country houses such as Longleat and Hardwicke Hall were built, miniature painting reached its high point, theatres thrived, the Queen attended the first performance of Shakespeare's A Midsummer Night's Dream. Composers such as William Byrd and Thomas Tallis worked in Elizabeth's court and at the Chapel Royal, St. James's Palace. The image of Elizabeth's reign is one of triumph and success. The Queen herself was often called Gloriana, Good Queen Bess, and the Virgin Queen. Investing in expensive clothes and jewelry, to look the part, like all contemporary sovereigns, she cultivated this image by touring the country in regional visits known as progresses, often riding on horseback rather than by carriage. Elizabeth made at least 25 progresses during her reign. However, Elizabeth's reign was one of considerable danger and difficulty for many, with threats of invasion from Spain through Ireland, and from France through Scotland. Much of northern England was in rebellion in 1569–70. A papal bull of 1570 specifically released Elizabeth's subjects from their allegiance, and she passed harsh laws against Roman Catholics after plots against her life were discovered. One such plot involved Mary, Queen of Scots, who had fled to England in 1568 after her second husband, Henry, Lord Darnley's, murder and her subsequent marriage to a man believed to have been involved in his murder, James, Earl of Bothwell. As a likely successor to Elizabeth, Mary spent 19 years as Elizabeth's prisoner because Mary was the focus for rebellion and possible assassination plots, such as the Babington Plot of 1586. Mary was also a temptation for potential invaders such as Philip II. In a letter of 1586 to Mary, Elizabeth wrote, "You have planned, to take my life and ruin my kingdom. I never proceeded so harshly against you." Despite Elizabeth's reluctance to take drastic action, on the insistence of Parliament and her advisers, Mary was tried, found guilty and executed in 1587. In 1588, aided by bad weather, the English navy scored a great victory over the Spanish invasion fleet of around 130 ships, the Armada. The Spanish Armada was intended to overthrow the Queen and re-establish Roman Catholicism by conquest, as Philip II believed he had a claim to the English throne through his marriage to Mary. During Elizabeth's long reign, the nation also suffered from high prices and severe economic depression, especially in the countryside, during the 1590s. The war against Spain was not very successful after the Armada had been beaten and, together with other campaigns, it was very costly. Though she kept a tight rein on government expenditure, Elizabeth left large debts to her successor. Wars during Elizabeth's reign are estimated to have cost over £5 million, at the prices of the time, which crown revenues could not match. In 1588, for example, Elizabeth's total annual revenue amounted to some £392,000. Despite the combination of financial strains and prolonged war after 1588, Parliament was not summoned more often. There were only 16 sittings of the Commons during Elizabeth's reign, 5 of which were in the period 1588 to 1601. Although Elizabeth freely used her power to veto legislation, she avoided confrontation and did not attempt to define Parliament's constitutional position and rights. Elizabeth chose never to marry. If she had chosen a foreign prince, he would have drawn England into foreign policies for his own advantages, as in her sister Mary's marriage to Philip of Spain, marrying a fellow countryman could have drawn the Queen into factional infighting. Elizabeth used her marriage prospects as a political tool in foreign and domestic policies. However, the Virgin Queen was presented as a selfless woman who sacrificed personal happiness for the good of the nation, to which she was, in essence, married. Late in her reign, she addressed Parliament in the so-called Golden Speech of 1601 when she told MPs, "There is no jewel, be it of never so high a price, which I set before this jewel, I mean your love." She seems to have been very popular with the vast majority of her subjects. Overall, Elizabeth's always shrewd and, when necessary, decisive leadership brought successes during a period of great danger both at home and abroad. She died at Richmond Palace on March 24, 1603, having become a legend in her lifetime. The date of her accession was a national holiday for 200 years. James VI of Scotland was Elizabeth's successor and became James I of England. In October 1562, less than 3 years after her accession to the throne, Elizabeth I contracted the highly infectious smallpox virus. This led to her becoming critically ill, and subsequently raised questions in regards to the governing of a country with an incapacitated queen, and speculation relating to the future of the English monarchy. Death and disease in medieval and early modern England was different to that of the modern day. People suffered and died from infectious diseases that no longer exist, including plague and sweating sickness, as well as illnesses as the result of poor sanitation and living conditions, such as dysentery, rickets, scurvy and tuberculosis. In the 16th century, medical knowledge continued to be influenced by ancient Greek teachings, including that illness, as well as personality, was significantly influenced by an imbalance of the body's 4 humors or fluids: blood, phlegm, black bile and yellow bile, all of which were connected to the different organs in the body. This understanding of the human body was coupled with contemporary beliefs that illness and disease were punishments for a person's previous sins or transgressions. The approach to treating those suffering would often be to focus on absolving sins and achieving salvations, given the limited access to physicians and medications, and the overarching influence that religion had on the everyday life. In the 1560s, plague or pestilence was the biggest killer in England, being responsible for up to 20% of all deaths in some areas, however, there were periods when outbreaks of the virulent bacterial infection increased the death rate, assisted by overpopulation, poor sanitation and warm weather. The outbreak, which commenced in the summer of 1563, 17,404 of 20,372 of all recorded deaths in the city of London were attributed to plague. Smallpox was another serious infectious disease that was prevalent during Elizabeth's early reign. An acute contagious disease caused by the variola virus, belonging to the orthopoxvirus family. Smallpox caused the deaths of millions of people worldwide before a vaccine was developed in 1796. This was the first successful vaccine to be developed, which led to smallpox's elimination worldwide in 1980, the only infectious disease to have achieved this status. Smallpox's fatality rate has been estimated as being 30%, death, primarily being the result of cardiovascular or liver complications, although even in the 16th century, the risk of adult deaths from smallpox was lower than that infected children and the elderly. However, women were found to be at an increased risk of death from the disease, over their male counterparts. Smallpox was transmitted through the respiratory tract, via infective droplets either during close contact with infected and symptomatic individuals, contact with infected skin lesions, or contact with contaminated clothing or bedding. The virus had an incubation period of 7 to 17 days, meaning that persons only became infectious once symptoms emerged. Early symptoms of smallpox included fever, fatigue, severe back pain, abdominal pain, vomiting. 2 to 3 days after these early symptoms presented themselves, only then would the characteristic rash synonymous with smallpox appear. It would normally begin on the infected person's face and hands, before spreading to the rest of the body, except on the palms or soles. Whilst initially red and flat, after a day or so, the rash would develop into blisters full of clear liquid, which would later fill with pus, known as pustules. After a further 8 to 9 days, during which time the body had started to produce an immune response, healing started to begin, the lesions would ulcerate and a crust would form on top, drying out the wound. Individuals remained infectious until the last scabs would fall off, which would often leaving deep pitting scarring or pockmarks. Lesions also developed in the mucous membranes, including on the tongue, larynx, upper trachea and esophagus. These painful wounds would ooze profusely, prior to ulceration, making speech, fluid and dietary intake difficult. The spread of smallpox during Elizabeth's early reign has been referred to as an epidemic, that being a widespread occurrence of a disease, in a particular community, at a particular time. In November 1562, English diplomat Sir Thomas Smith gave a description of its spread, in particular amongst the ladies in Elizabeth's household and at court. Smallpox has vexed England these 2 or 3 years, having had no plague to speak of for 12 years, in England it took aged folks and ladies. The Duchess of Suffolk had it first, the Countess of Bedford died of it, and, ladies of 40, 50 and 55 years of age have died of it. This disease is best acquainted with duchesses, marchionesses, and countesses. Whilst Catherine Bertie, Dowager Duchess of Suffolk, recovered after contracting smallpox in February 1562, the first high-profile victim of this epidemic that summer appears to have been Margaret St. John, Countess of Bedford, the first wife of Francis Russell, 2nd Earl of Bedford, a popular and young member of Elizabeth's Privy Council. Despite having a large family, the couple had 7 children over 12 years, who survived into adulthood. Margaret maintained her position within Elizabeth's household as a Lady of the Privy Chamber. This was the same position that her eldest daughter Anne, later Countess of Warwick, would later hold, with Anne's niece Lady Anne Clifford claiming that she was more beloved and in greater favour with the Queen than any other woman in the kingdom. Lady Russell appears to have contracted the illness at Greenwich Palace over the summer months, where it was known that the court was gathered. Likely showing symptoms of the disease, Margaret withdrew to Woburn Abbey, Bedfordshire, the former monastery which came into the possession of the Russell family following the dissolution of the monasteries. On August 27, 1562, the 29-year-old countess lost her fight against the disease, her death being immortalized over 80 years later in The Great Picture. The ambitious portrait commissioned by her granddaughter Anne Clifford. After her death, her body was taken the 35 miles south back to the Russell family seat of Shanes, Buckinghamshire, where her funeral was held on September 10, 1562. On September 16, 1562, Elizabeth and the court left Greenwich, and headed, via Lambeth, to Hampton Court Palace, an early 16th-century royal residence, located on the riverbanks of the Thames, near Kew, Middlesex, which had been a favourite of the Queen's late father, Henry VIII. Once at Hampton Court, business within the court resumed as normal, including Elizabeth receiving foreign diplomats, in addition to her appointment on October 1 of Ambrose Dudley, 3rd Earl of Warwick, as Lieutenant General. The Queen had pledged her support for French Huguenots in Normandy, and she had nominated her Master of Ordnance as the trusted man whom she would send to garrison the town, at the head of 6,000 troops. It was on October 10, 1562, when the 29-year-old Elizabeth first started to feel unwell, likely showing the early, but undiagnosed, symptoms of smallpox, including a headache. The Queen made attempts to shake off her ailments, including taking a bath, and then engaged in a bracing walk out in the grounds of the palace. These attempts were unsuccessful, as within a matter of hours, Elizabeth had taken to her bed with a fever. Her German physician, Burchard Cranach, referred to as Dr. Burkitt, was immediately summoned. He had been recommended to her by her cousin, Henry Carey, 1st Baron Hunsdon, after successfully treating him of a dangerous illness. Following his examination, Dr. Burkitt surmised that the Queen was presenting with the early symptoms of smallpox. Refusing to acknowledge his diagnosis, in the absence of the characteristic rash, Dr. Burkitt was dismissed, although Elizabeth's health continued to deteriorate, her fever not abating. She was unable to receive an audience with Alvaro de la Quadra, the Spanish ambassador, on October 13, and on October 15, in her correspondence to Mary, Queen of Scots, written in French, Elizabeth ended her letter, "The hot fever which is upon me prevents me writing more at present." By October 16, Elizabeth's health deteriorated significantly, with increased difficulties in speaking, and fluctuating levels of consciousness, including a period of unconsciousness for 24 hours. Whilst there remained no evidence of rash or lesions, physicians were now confident in the diagnosis of smallpox. In response to her significant decline in health, Elizabeth's Privy Council, led by William Cecil, Secretary of State, gathered at Hampton Court, with Ambassador de la Quadra commenting that, if the Queen die it will be very soon, within a few days at latest, and now all the talk is who is to be her successor. Despite being unmarried, with no children, Elizabeth had not nominated a legal heir or successor. However, one of the Queen's closest living relatives, Catherine Grey, Countess of Hertford, was viewed by many as being the Queen's legitimate heir, having been named by Henry VIII in the line of succession, on account of her mother, the King's niece. Unlike her father and elder sister Jane, who had lost their lives as a result of treason charges in 1554, Catherine and her younger sister Mary, had been able to retain positions at the royal court, initially in the household of Mary I, and later in the household of their kinswoman Elizabeth. Interest had remained on the beautiful and engaging Catherine after Elizabeth's accession to the throne, given that a male child of hers would be a potential strong candidate for Elizabeth's successor. Catherine, however, engaged in a secret, and often tumultuous, relationship with Edward Seymour, 1st Earl of Hertford, which culminated in a clandestine and unauthorized marriage in December 1560. When news of the union became known, a furious Elizabeth ordered a heavily pregnant Catherine to be imprisoned in the Tower of London, perceiving her actions to be an attempt to usurp her from the throne. At the time of Elizabeth's illness, Catherine remained imprisoned in the Tower. She had safely delivered her first son in September 1561, named after his father. However, young Edward's legitimacy was quickly brought into question, as was his parents' marriage. An ecclesiastical court hearing found that Catherine's marriage to Hertford was invalid, and therefore any children produced from their union would be deemed illegitimate, and therefore ineligible to be in line for the throne. Whilst there were those within Elizabeth's inner circle and Privy Council who continued to support Catherine's position, others, including the Queen's favourite Robert Dudley and new widower Frances Russell, loudly opposed this. Other suggested claimants included Mary, Queen of Scots, and Dudley's brother-in-law Henry Hastings, 3rd Earl of Huntingdon, with discussions taking place in and around Hampton Court, including Henry Fitzalan, 12th Earl of Arundel's home, likely nearby Nonsuch Palace. However, despite conversations between the different religious and political factions that had emerged, no final decision was ever reached regarding a successor. Whilst the majority of those at Hampton Court remained preoccupied with potential arrangements in the event of her death, Elizabeth's maternal cousin Hunsdon's focus was on her survival, and so persuaded Dr. Burkitt to recommence his care and treatment of the Queen. Following traditional curative methods, Dr. Burkitt ordered that the critically ill Elizabeth be wrapped in red cloth, laid on a pallet by the fire and given a potion. The intent of this treatment was to encourage the eruption of the rash and subsequent lesions, which had not yet formed, and as such were felt to be putting her at greater risk. Within 2 hours of this treatment, the Queen was awake and conscious, although remained gravely ill. Elizabeth reportedly remained conscious for 4 hours, and aware of her serious made requests that Dudley, to be named as Lord Protector, accompanied by a generous salary, in the event of her death or ongoing incapacitation. The memory of his father John Dudley, 1st Duke of Northumberland in his role as Lord President of Edward VI Regency Council lingered, with many, including Northumberland's former personal secretary Cecil, believing that another Lord Protectorship would cause division, if not the risk of civil war. However, the council gave their word to Elizabeth that they would carry out her wishes if she was not to survive. Dudley was subsequently admitted to the Privy Council on October 20, cementing himself in the heart of her administration, although was joined by his greatest political rival, Thomas Howard, 4th Duke of Norfolk. It was shortly after this gathering of Privy Councillors at her bedside, that Elizabeth, continuing to be attended to and treated by Dr. Burkitt, discovered that the rash was finally starting to appear on her hands. It had been felt that the delay in the rash presenting itself was the cause of her grave illness, and that, it was essential that the sickness exit her body through its characteristic lesions, or it would continue to torment and poison her. Paul, 2022, page 301. The Queen was now begrudgingly accepting of the diagnosis of smallpox, and in response to her bitter complaints, Dr. Burkitt reportedly replied, "By God's pestilence, which is better, to have the pox in the hands, in the face, or have them in the heart and kill the whole body." From then on, the disease progressed as expected, with the rash spreading across her body, pustules subsequently forming and then ulcerating and crusting. Elizabeth remained in bed for a further 6 days, until she was able to resume her duties on October 25, with Ambassador de la Quadra commenting that the Queen is now out of bed, and is only attending to the marks on her face to avoid disfigurement. During the Queen's illness, she was treated by only a small number of attendants, in order to reduce the risk of further transmission. One of those select few was Dudley's sister, Mary, Lady Sidney, who had been appointed to the household as an unsalaried lady of the bedchamber. Being in continuous and close contact with the Queen during the illness, including the highly infectious window, in the Queen's closely confined bedchamber, Mary herself began to display symptoms. She quickly withdrew to the Sidney home of Penshurst Place, Kent, where she also successfully recovered from the disease. However, Mary's health had been significantly affected by her illness, described as a great extremity of sickness, in addition to prolific scarring, which eventually led to her withdrawal from public court life. Her husband, Sir Henry Sidney, who had also been dispatched to France along with his brother-in-law Warwick, returned to find his wife's appearance significantly altered. Years later he reflected on this, writing, "I left her a full fair lady in mine eye, at least the fairest, and when I returned I found her as foul a lady as the small pox could make her, the scars of which, to her resolute discomfort, ever since hath done and doth remain in her face." Despite the long-lasting impact on her health, both Mary and Elizabeth were fortunate to have survived this particularly virulent strain of smallpox, as another of the Queen's trusted ladies, Sybil Penn, died in November, after contracting the disease. Elizabeth famously used heavy makeup throughout her reign on her face, neck and hands, which was depicted on numerous portraits, later referred to as her mask of youth. There are inconsistent reports into the degree of scaring the Queen suffered as a result of smallpox. She likely displayed the characteristic pockmarks in the immediate aftermath of the disease, as a result of scabs forming over the pustules as part of the healing process, which were known to be more prevalent on the face. Whilst her scars do appear to have faded over time, Elizabeth, however, continued to apply heavy makeup, in an attempt to hide these, in addition to her aging skin. She was known to use a mixture of white lead and vinegar, which gave her the recognizable pale complexion, in addition to red paste, made from plant dyes, cochineal and beeswax, which provided a colored contrast to the lips and cheeks. As Bormann recognizes, the impact and risks associated with the long-term use of these products was significant. Not only did its use break down her skin barrier and dry it out, but it also likely contributed to her hair loss, with Elizabeth being known to wear wigs during the latter part of her reign. Long-term exposure to mercury, which was known to be in cleansers, was also known to have significant side effects, including insomnia, headaches, irritability, and mood swings. The glory that was Greece and the grandeur that was Rome ended when Rome fell to Germanic tribes in the 5th century AD. The ancient Romans, Greeks, and Egyptians had pushed forward medical knowledge, but after the demise of these civilizations, artistic, cultural, and scientific outputs were sadly lacking when compared to both earlier and later times. Medical knowledge stagnated in the Middle Ages and did not develop until the 17th–18th centuries. The center of Western learning shifted to Constantinople, now Istanbul, the capital of the Byzantine Empire, which had been Christian since the 4th century AD, with the conversion of the Roman Emperor Constantine. The Church quickly gained converts, and power, throughout Western Europe. The Roman Catholic Church effectively dominated what direction the medical world took. Any view different from the established Roman Catholic view was labeled heresy and punished accordingly. The Roman Catholic Church stated that illnesses were punishments from God and those who were ill were so because they were sinners. No one contradicted such worldview, it was accepted. Suffering was seen as part of the human condition. As people became obsessed with their souls, they neglected their bodies, medicine became a matter of faith and prescriptions became prayers. Medicine became steeped in superstition. Ideas about the origin and cure of disease were based on factors such as destiny, sin, and heavenly influences. Therefore, in this period, there was no tradition of scientific medicine, and observations went hand in hand with spiritual and religious influences. Medicine during the Middle Ages was composed of a mixture of existing ideas from antiquity and spiritual influences. Standard medical knowledge was based chiefly upon surviving Greek and Roman texts preserved in monasteries and elsewhere. In the Middle Ages, the practice of medicine was still rooted in the Greek tradition. The body was made up of 4 humors: yellow bile, phlegm, black bile, and blood. These were controlled by the 4 elements: fire, water, earth, and air. An imbalance of humors caused disease and the body could be purged of excess by bleeding, cupping, and leeching, medical practices that continued through the Middle Ages. Many diseases were thought to be caused by an excess of blood in the body, and bloodletting was seen as the obvious cure. An important aspect in the treatment of ailments was diet. The food choices we make can have an important impact on health. This was known since antiquity, for Hippocrates is quoted as saying, "Let food be thy medicine and medicine be thy food." The Greek concept of the 4 humors as revised by Galen was the basis of all diagnosis and treatment, but it had evolved into a theory of temperament, which accounted for psychological and social as well as physical characteristics. An excess of blood, phlegm, yellow bile, or black bile made a person sanguine, phlegmatic, choleric, or melancholic. Physicians were, however, trained in the art of diagnosis. Observation, palpation, feeling the pulse, and urine examination were the tools of the doctor throughout the Middle Ages. They were often shown in manuscripts holding a urine flask up for inspection or feeling the pulse. On first visiting patients, doctors noted their appearance, listened to their stories, felt their pulses, and examined their urine. Urine inspection was the most common method of diagnosis, and the urine flask became the symbol of the doctor. In our time, of course, the stethoscope is the symbol of the doctor, but that too may change. The belief in classical antiquity that the moon and planets played an important part in good health continued in the Middle Ages. They believed that the human body and the planets were made up of the same 4 elements: earth, fire, air, and water. For the body to operate well, all 4 elements had to be in harmony with no imbalances. It was believed that the moon had the greatest influence on fluids on Earth, and that it was the moon that had the ability to affect positively or negatively the 4 elements in the body. Where the moon and planets were, a knowledge of this was considered important when making a diagnosis and deciding on a course of treatment. Physicians needed to know when to treat a patient and when not to, and the position of the planets determined this. A so-called zodiac chart also determined when bloodletting should be done, as it was believed by some that the moon and planets determined this as well. Medical charts informed physicians what not to do for people born under a certain astrology sign. Galen was the most influential ancient physician during the Middle Ages. He held undisputed authority over medicine in the Middle Ages. He described the 4 classic symptoms of inflammation, redness, pain, heat, and swelling, and added much to the knowledge of infectious disease and pharmacology. His anatomic knowledge of humans was defective because it was based on dissection of animals, mainly apes, sheep, goats, and pigs. Some of Galen's teachings tended to hold back medical progress. His theory, for example, that the blood carried the pneuma, or life spirit, which gave it its red color, coupled with the erroneous notion that the blood passed through a porous wall between the ventricles of the heart, delayed the understanding of circulation and did much to discourage research in physiology. His most important work, however, was in the field of the form and function of muscles and the function of the areas of the spinal cord. He also excelled in diagnosis and prognosis. The importance of Galen's work cannot be underestimated, for through his writings, knowledge of Greek medicine was subsequently transmitted to the Western world by the Arabs. Herbs, flowers, and perfumes formed a large part of everyday life in the Middle Ages and were inextricably linked with magic and medicine. Medicinal plants and herbs were an important and major part in the pharmacopoeia. Medicines were made from herbs, spices, and resins. Dioscorides, a Greek, wrote his Materia Medica in 65 AD. This was a practical text dealing with the medicinal use of more than 600 plants in the 2nd century. Although the original text of Dioscorides is lost, there are many surviving copies. His texts formed the basis of much of the herbal medicine practiced until 1500. Some plants were used for specific disorders, while others were credited with curing multiple diseases. In many cases, preparations were made of many different herbs. The oldest surviving English herbal manuscript is the Saxon Leech Book of Bald, written in about AD 900 to 950. Vapor and herb baths were prescribed for all kinds of ailments. The book shows how common it was to smoke the sick with fragrant woods and plants. Scented garlands decorated homes. Every herb, every tree, and every flower had its own special quality. But of all the scents, the rose is the one most associated with the Middle Ages. Crusaders brought home many different kinds of perfumes from the Middle East. One among them was rosewater, and the nobility put bowls of rosewater for guests to wash their hands after meals. Rose petals were also used to perfume baths. However, in the Middle Ages, the study of medicinal plants was in the hands of monks who in their monasteries planted and experimented on the species described in classic texts. No monastic garden would have been complete without medicinal plants. The sick went to the monastery, local herbalist, or apothecary to obtain healing herbs. Most monasteries developed herb gardens for use in the production of herbal cures, and these remained a part of folk medicine, as well as were being used by some professional physicians. Books of herbal remedies were produced by monks, as many monks were skilled at producing books and manuscripts and tending both medicinal gardens and the sick. However, works of this period simply imitated those of classical antiquity. Pliny's work Naturalis Historia, a work that includes myths and folklore, trees, and medicinal plants, and written in about 77 to 79 AD, and Dioscorides de Materia Medica are frequently mentioned in classical antiquity, and translations are widely copied in the Middle Ages. Headache and aching joints were treated with sweet-smelling herbs such as rose, lavender, sage, and hay. A mixture of henbane and hemlock was applied to aching joints. Coriander was used to reduce fever. Stomach pains and sickness were treated with wormwood, mint, and balm. Lung problems were treated with a medicine made of licorice and comfrey. Cough syrups and drinks were prescribed for chest and head colds and coughs. Wounds were cleaned, and vinegar was widely used as a cleansing agent, as it was believed that it would kill disease. Mint was used in treating venom and wounds. Myrrh was used as an antiseptic on wounds. There was no experimentation to test the efficacy of a particular herb treatment on ailments. If successful, it was ascribed to their action upon the humors within the body and the belief that such natural herbal remedies must have been intended for such purpose by God. As Origen, an early Christian theologian and biblical scholar stated, "For those who are adorned with religion use physicians as servants of God, knowing that he himself assigned both herbs and other things to grow on the earth." Such interweaving of medicine and religion, of medical thought and theological considerations is striking in the medieval period. The use of herbs also drew on the doctrine of signatures, a philosophy shared by herbalists from the time of Dioscorides to Galen, and which stated that herbs that resemble various parts of the body can be used to treat ailments of that part of the body. For example, the spotted leaves of lungwort, which was used for tuberculosis, bear a similarity to the lungs of a diseased patient. The medieval Christian Church provided a theological justification for this philosophy by reasoning that God had provided some form of alleviation for every ill, and these things, be they animal, vegetal, or mineral, carried a mark or a signature upon them that gave an indication of their usefulness. This of course is regarded as superstition, since there is no scientific evidence whatsoever that plant shapes and colors help in the discovery of medical uses of plants. One of the most devastating pandemics in human history was the Black Death. It is thought to have started in China or Central Asia before spreading west. It swept through the Mediterranean and Europe in the 13th and 14th centuries. By 1349, one-third of the Islamic world had perished and is thought to have killed 30 to 60% of Europe's population. It took 150 years for Europe's population to recover. The plague reoccurred occasionally in Europe until the 19th century. The aftermath of the plague created a series of religious, social, and economic upheavals which had profound effects on the course of European history. The Black Death arrived in Europe by sea in October 1347 when 12 Genoese trading ships docked at the Sicilian port of Messina after a long journey through the Black Sea. The people who gathered on the docks to greet the ships were met with a horrifying surprise. Most of the sailors aboard the ships were dead, and those who were still alive were gravely ill. They were overcome with fever, unable to keep food down, and were delirious from pain. Strangest of all, they were covered in mysterious black boils that oozed blood and pus and gave their illness its name, the Black Death. The Sicilian authorities hastily ordered the fleet of death ships out of the harbor, but it was too late. Over the next 5 years, the mysterious Black Death would kill more than 20 million people in Europe, almost one-third of the continent's population. Even before the death ships pulled into port at Messina, many Europeans had heard rumors about a great pestilence that was carving a deadly path across the trade routes of the Near and Far East. Early in the 1340s, the disease had struck China, India, Persia, Syria, and Egypt. However, they were not equipped for the horrible reality of the Black Death. The Black Death was terrifyingly contagious. When people who were perfectly healthy went to bed at night, they could be dead by morning. No medical knowledge existed at the time to deal with the infection. Bacteria and contagion were unknown. Medieval doctors tended to blame a pestilential atmosphere, caused either by planetary conjunction or by earthquakes and volcanic eruptions that had occurred before the disease appeared. Doctors tried every possible cure and prevention. Physicians relied on crude and unsophisticated techniques such as bloodletting and boil lancing, practices that were dangerous as well as unsanitary, and superstitious practices such as burning aromatic herbs and bathing in rosewater or vinegar. Some stressed that olive oil, as an article of food, is fatal. 1/4 bathing is injurious. Others believed that the air had become stiff and had to be broken up by loud noises. So, bells were rung, guns were fired, and birds were released to fly around rooms. In the absence of medical understanding of such a frightful disease, people turned to prayers and pilgrimage. According to the Church, the Black Death was God's punishment for the sinfulness of humankind. People invoked Christ, the Virgin Mary, and saints for help. People who believed that they had sinned showed their true repentance by inflicting pain on themselves, the so-called flagellants who whipped themselves to show their love of God and their true repentance at being a sinner, a practice that is still reenacted during Holy Week in some Catholic countries. Clearly, of course, this custom was no cure for the plague, but power of faith was potent medicine for the sick in the Middle Ages. Today, physicians understand that the Black Death, now known as the plague, is spread by a bacillus called Yersinia pestis. The French biologist Alexander Yersin discovered this germ at the end of the 19th century. They know that the bacillus travels from person to person through the air and saliva, as well as through the bite of infected fleas and rats. Both of these pests could be found almost everywhere in medieval Europe, but they were particularly at home aboard ships of all kinds, which is how the deadly plague made its way through one European port city after another. Not long after Genoese trading ships brought the disease to Messina, Sicily, the Black Death spread to the port of Marseilles in France and the port of Tunis in North Africa. Then it reached Rome and Florence, two cities at the center of an elaborate web of trade routes. By the middle of 1348, the Black Death had struck Paris, Bordeaux, Lyon, and London. This grim sequence of events is terrifying, but comprehensible to us today. In the middle of the 14th century, however, there seemed to be no rational explanation for it. No one knew exactly how the Black Death was transmitted from one patient to another. According to one doctor, for example, instantaneous death occurs when the aerial spirit escaping from the eyes of the sick man strikes the healthy person standing near and looking at the sick. No one knew how to prevent or treat it. Healthy people panicked and did all they could to avoid the sick. Doctors refused to see patients, priests refused to administer last rites. Shopkeepers closed stores. Many people fled the cities for the countryside, but even there they could not escape the disease. It affected cows, sheep, goats, pigs, and chickens, as well as people. And many people, desperate to save themselves, even abandoned their sick and dying loved ones. Boccaccio wrote, "Each thought to secure immunity for himself." The Black Death epidemic had run its course by the early 1350s, but the plague reappeared every few generations for centuries. Modern sanitation, public health practices, and antibiotics have greatly diminished the impact of the disease, but have not eliminated it. Currently, plague occurs in fewer than 3,000 people per year worldwide. It can be deadly if not treated promptly with antibiotics. The Black Death epidemic in the 14th century was catastrophic to European medicine for prevailing medical theories focused on religious rather scientific explanations for this epidemic. Formerly, when religion was strong and science weak, men mistook magic for medicine. Now, when science is strong and religion weak, men mistake medicine for magic. Battle of Berlin, one of the final battles of World War II. It took place from April 20 to May 2, 1945, and it ended with the fall of Berlin, the capital of the Third Reich, to the Soviet Red Army, which took revenge for the suffering of the Soviet people since 1941. In April 1945, the Soviet Union assembled outside Berlin one of the largest concentrations of military power ever seen, more than 1.5 million soldiers. Within the city, already repeatedly pounded by Allied bombing, refugees and citizens were protected by a small force of stragglers and the remnants of shattered formations, supported by ill-equipped militia and units of the Hitler Youth, one battalion of which was sent into battle with an average age of 14. In a race to win the glory of capturing the city of Berlin, Soviet marshals Ivan Konev and Georgy Zhukov were willing to accept enormous casualties and inflict colossal damage. After Vienna fell on April 14, they moved a full 20 armies, reinforced by 8,500 warplanes and some 6,500 tanks, from various sectors of the front. By April 16 the two forces had linked up and encircled Berlin. Soviet artillery fired nearly 2 million shells during the final assault. Within the city, there were few fixed defenses. The urban terrain offered some advantage to its defenders, especially because, in their hurry to advance, Red Army tanks went in without adequate infantry support. The Hitler Youth could, and often did, destroy Soviet tanks by ambushing them with Panzerfaust anti-tank rockets. Indeed, many defenders fought with suicidal courage. 3 of them, armed only with a machine gun, held off Soviet attacks on the Helen Sea Bridge for 2 days. However, the Soviets' firepower was overwhelming. A single shot from a sniper could be answered by artillery fire, or by Katyusha rockets, leveling the entire building from whence it came. The suspicion that a cellar might contain defenders would result in Soviet grenades being tossed in, with no regard for civilian lives. For German women, the greatest fear was rape, and Soviet soldiers committed this on a vast scale. In his bunker, in the center of the city, Adolf Hitler remained convinced that Berlin could be saved. He gave hopeless orders for armies that scarcely existed to break the siege. For his part, Soviet leader Joseph Stalin was obsessed with taking the Reichstag building, although it had not been used since 1933 and had no strategic value. This fixation on a largely symbolic target cost heavily in the number of Soviet soldiers lost. Many Berliners, desperate for the nightmare to end, began hanging white or red flags from their windows, offering surrender or even welcome to the Red Army. However, this practice entailed risking execution by firing squads, and there is little evidence that Soviet troops paid any attention. As the Red Army closed in around the final enclaves of resistance, Hitler's suicide on April 30 gave the garrison commander, General Helmuth Weidling, the chance to surrender. SS troops were doomed if captured, but some still tried to fight on, others committed suicide. Most were thankful that the ordeal was over. They emerged to take stock of the massive devastation the city of Berlin had endured and to come to terms with its new masters. The general surrender of German forces was completed 5 days later. In the end, the Red Army suffered some 350,000 casualties, with at least 450,000 German military casualties and an estimated 300,000 civilians killed or wounded. Berlin blockade, international crisis that arose from an attempt by the Soviet Union, in 1948-49, to force the Western Allied powers, the United States, the United Kingdom, and France, to abandon their post-World War II jurisdictions in West Berlin. In March 1948 the Allied powers decided to unite their different occupation zones of Germany into a single economic unit. In protest, the Soviet representative withdrew from the Allied Control Council. Coincident with the introduction of a new Deutsche Mark in West Berlin, as throughout West Germany, which the Soviets regarded as a violation of agreements with the Allies, the Soviet occupation forces in eastern Germany began a blockade of all rail, road, and water communications between Berlin and the West. On June 24 the Soviets announced that the four-power administration of Berlin had ceased and that the Allies no longer had any rights there. On June 26 the United States and Britain began to supply the city with food and other vital supplies by air. They also organized a similar airlift in the opposite direction of West Berlin's greatly reduced industrial exports. By mid-July the Soviet Army of Occupation in East Germany had increased to 40 divisions, against 8 in the Allied sectors. By the end of July 3 groups of U.S. strategic bombers had been sent as reinforcements to Britain. Tension remained high, but war did not break out. Despite dire shortages of fuel and electricity, the airlift kept life going in West Berlin for 11 months, until on May 12, 1949, the Soviet Union lifted the blockade. The airlift continued until September 30, at a total cost of $224 million and after delivery of 2,323,738 tons of food, fuel, machinery, and other supplies. The end to the blockade was brought about because of countermeasures imposed by the Allies on East German communications and, above all, because of the Western embargo placed on all strategic exports from the Eastern Bloc. As a result of the blockade and airlift, Berlin became a symbol of the Allies' willingness to oppose further Soviet expansion in Europe. Red Army, Soviet army created by the Communist government after the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917. The name Red Army was abandoned in 1946. The Russian Imperial Army and Navy, together with other imperial institutions of Tsarist Russia, disintegrated after the outbreak of the Russian Revolution of 1917. By a decree of January 28, January 15, Old Style, 1918, the Council of People's Commissars created a workers' and peasants' Red Army on a voluntary basis. The first units, fighting with a revolutionary fervor, distinguished themselves against the Germans at Narva and Pskov on February 23, 1918, which became Soviet Army Day. On April 22, 1918, the Soviet government decreed compulsory military training for workers and peasants who did not employ hired labor, and this was the beginning of the Red Army. Its founder was Leon Trotsky, People's Commissar for War from March 1918 until he lost the post in November 1924. The Red Army was recruited exclusively from among workers and peasants and immediately faced the problem of creating a competent and reliable officers' corps. Trotsky met this problem by mobilizing former officers of the Imperial Army. Up to 1921 about 50,000 such officers served in the Red Army and with but few exceptions remained loyal to the Soviet regime. Political advisors called commissars were attached to all army units to watch over the reliability of officers and to carry out political propaganda among the troops. As the Russian Civil War continued, the short-term officers' training schools began to turn out young officers who were regarded as more reliable politically. The number of Communist Party members increased among the Red Army's ranks from 19 to 49% during 1925 to 33, and among officers this increase was much higher. Moreover, all commanders were graduates of Soviet military academies and officers' training schools, admission to which was limited to those recommended by the Communist Party. In May 1937 a drastic purge, affecting all potential opponents of Joseph Stalin's leadership, decimated the officer corps and greatly reduced the morale and efficiency of the Red Army. On June 12, Mikhail Nikolaevich Tukhachevsky, first Deputy People's Commissar of War, and 7 other Red Army generals were found guilty of plotting to betray the Soviet Union to Japan and Germany, and all were shot. Many other generals and colonels were either cashiered or sent to forced labor camps, or both. The purge's effects were apparent in the serious defeat suffered by the Red Army during the first months of the German invasion, 1941, but a corps of younger commanders soon emerged to lead the Soviet Union to victory in World War II. By war's end the Soviet armed forces numbered 11,365,000 officers and men. Demobilization, however, started toward the end of 1945, and in a few years the armed forces fell to fewer than 3 million troops. In 1946 the word Red was removed from the name of the armed forces. Thus, a Soviet soldier, hitherto known as a Krasnoarmych, Red Army man, was subsequently called simply a Ryadovoy, ranker. Discipline in the Soviet forces was always strict and punishments severe. During World War II, penal battalions were given suicidal tasks. In 1960, however, new regulations were introduced making discipline, and certainly punishments, less severe. Officers were to use more persuasion and were charged with developing their troops' political consciousness, thus ending the dual control of military commanders and political commissars. By contrast, enlisted men increasingly brutalized each other, conscripts with longer service took advantage of new recruits, and ethnic communities worked out mutual hostilities in the barracks. The era of the revolutionary Red Army ended, in fact as well as in name, long before the final disappearance of the Soviet Union. In Russia, February 23, now known as Defender of the Fatherland Day, is still the official day to honor military veterans. Cold War, the open yet restricted rivalry that developed after World War II between the United States and the Soviet Union and their respective allies. The Cold War was waged on political, economic, and propaganda fronts and had only limited recourse to weapons. The term was first used by the English writer George Orwell in an article published in 1945 to refer to what he predicted would be a nuclear stalemate between 2 or 3 monstrous superstates, each possessed of a weapon by which millions of people can be wiped out in a few seconds. It was first used in the United States by the American financier and presidential advisor Bernard Baruch in a speech at the State House in Columbia, South Carolina, in 1947. A brief treatment of the Cold War follows. For full treatment, see International Relations. Following the surrender of Nazi Germany in May 1945 near the close of World War II, the uneasy wartime alliance between the United States and Great Britain on the one hand and the Soviet Union on the other began to unravel. By 1948 the Soviets had installed left-wing governments in the countries of Eastern Europe that had been liberated by the Red Army. The Americans and the British feared the permanent Soviet domination of Eastern Europe and the threat of Soviet-influenced communist parties coming to power in the democracies of Western Europe. The Soviets, on the other hand, were determined to maintain control of Eastern Europe in order to safeguard against any possible renewed threat from Germany, and they were intent on spreading communism worldwide, largely for ideological reasons. The Cold War had solidified by 1947–48, when U.S. aid provided under the Marshall Plan to Western Europe had brought those countries under American influence and the Soviets had installed openly communist regimes in Eastern Europe. The Cold War reached its peak in 1948–53. In this period the Soviets unsuccessfully blockaded the western-held sectors of West Berlin. 1948–49, the United States and its European allies formed the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, a unified military command to resist the Soviet presence in Europe. 1949, the Soviets exploded their first atomic warhead. 1949, thus ending the American monopoly on the atomic bomb. The Chinese Communists came to power in mainland China. 1949, and the Soviet-supported Communist government of North Korea invaded US-supported South Korea in 1950, setting off an indecisive Korean War that lasted until 1953. From 1953 to 1957 Cold War tensions relaxed somewhat, largely owing to the death of the longtime Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin in 1953, nevertheless, the standoff remained. A unified military organization among the Soviet bloc countries, the Warsaw Pact, was formed in 1955, and West Germany was admitted into NATO that same year. Another intense stage of the Cold War was in 1958–62. The United States and the Soviet Union began developing intercontinental ballistic missiles, and in 1962 the Soviets began secretly installing missiles in Cuba that could be used to launch nuclear attacks on U.S. cities. This sparked the Cuban Missile Crisis, 1962, a confrontation that brought the two superpowers to the brink of war before an agreement was reached to withdraw the missiles. The Cuban Missile Crisis showed that neither the United States nor the Soviet Union were ready to use nuclear weapons for fear of the other's retaliation, and thus of mutual atomic annihilation. The two superpowers soon signed the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty of 1963, which banned above-ground nuclear weapons testing. But the crisis also hardened the Soviets' determination never again to be humiliated by their military inferiority, and they began a build-up of both conventional and strategic forces that the United States was forced to match for the next 25 years. Throughout the Cold War the United States and the Soviet Union avoided direct military confrontation in Europe and engaged in actual combat operations only to keep allies from defecting to the other side or to overthrow them after they had done so. Thus, the Soviet Union sent troops to preserve communist rule in East Germany, 1953, Hungary, 1956, Czechoslovakia, 1968, and Afghanistan, 1979. For its part, the United States helped overthrow a left-wing government in Guatemala, 1954, supported an unsuccessful invasion of Cuba, 1961, invaded the Dominican Republic, 1965, and Grenada, 1983, and undertook a long, 1954–75, an unsuccessful effort to prevent Communist North Vietnam from bringing South Vietnam under its rule. In the course of the 1960s and 70s, however, the bipolar struggle between the Soviet and American blocs gave way to a more complicated pattern of international relationships in which the world was no longer split into two clearly opposed blocs. A major split had occurred between the Soviet Union and China in 1960 and widened over the years, shattering the unity of the Communist bloc. In the meantime, Western Europe and Japan achieved dynamic economic growth in the 1950s and 60s, reducing their relative inferiority to the United States. Less powerful countries had more room to assert their independence and often showed themselves resistant to superpower coercion or cajoling. The 1970s saw an easing of Cold War tensions as evinced in the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, SALT, that led to the SALT I and II agreements of 1972 and 1979, respectively, in which the two superpowers set limits on their anti-ballistic missiles and on their strategic missiles capable of carrying nuclear weapons. That was followed by a period of renewed Cold War tensions in the early 1980s as the two superpowers continued their massive arms buildup and competed for influence in the Third World. But the Cold War began to break down in the late 1980s during the administration of Soviet leader Mikhail S. Gorbachev. He dismantled the totalitarian aspects of the Soviet system and began efforts to democratize the Soviet political system. When communist regimes in the Soviet bloc countries of Eastern Europe collapsed in 1989–90, Gorbachev acquiesced in their fall. The rise to power of democratic governments in East Germany, Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia was quickly followed by the unification of West and East Germany under NATO auspices, again with Soviet approval. Gorbachev's internal reforms had meanwhile weakened his own Communist Party and allowed power to shift to Russia and the other constituent republics of the Soviet Union. On December 31, 1991, the Soviet Union formally ceased to exist, and 15 Soviet republics became independent countries: Armenia, Azerbaijan, Belarus, Estonia, Georgia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Latvia, Lithuania, Moldova, Russia, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, Ukraine, and Uzbekistan. The Cold War had come to an end. War crime, in international law, serious violation of the laws or customs of war as defined by international customary law and international treaties. The term war crime has been difficult to define with precision, and its usage has evolved constantly, particularly since the end of World War I. The first systematic attempt to define a broad range of war crimes was the Instructions for the Government of Armies of the United States in the Field, also known as the Lieber Code after its main author, Francis Lieber, which was issued by U.S. President Abraham Lincoln during the American Civil War and distributed among Union military personnel in 1863. For example, the Lieber Code held that it was a serious breach of the law of war to force the subjects of the enemy into service for the victorious government and prohibited wanton violence committed against persons in the invaded country, including rape, maiming, and murder, all of which carried the penalty of death. More recently, definitions of war crimes have been codified in international statutes, such as those creating the International Criminal Court and the War Crimes Tribunals in Yugoslavia and Rwanda, for use in international war crimes tribunals. In contrast to earlier definitions, modern definitions are more expansive and criminalize certain behaviors committed by civilians as well as by military personnel. Immediately following World War I, the victorious Allied powers convened a special commission on the responsibility of the authors of the war and on enforcement of penalties. The Commission's report recommended that war crimes trials be conducted before the victors' national courts and, when appropriate, before an inter-Allied tribunal. The Allies prepared an initial list of about 900 suspected war criminals and submitted the list to Germany. Although heads of state traditionally had enjoyed immunity from prosecution, the Commission's main target was Germany's Emperor, Kaiser, William II, whom most of the Allies, though not the United States, wished to hold responsible for numerous violations of the laws of war. William, however, took refuge in the Netherlands, which refused to extradite him, and he was never tried. Most of the remaining suspected war criminals on the list similarly managed to avoid prosecution, because Germany was reluctant to turn them over to the Allies. Instead, a compromise was reached whereby the Allies permitted a small number of suspects to be tried in Germany before the Supreme Court in Leipzig. These prosecutions resulted in few convictions, with most sentences ranging from a few months to 4 years in prison. The next major attempt to prosecute war criminals occurred in Europe and Asia after World War II. Throughout the war, the Allies had cited atrocities committed by the Nazi regime of Adolf Hitler and announced their intention to punish those guilty of war crimes. The Moscow Declaration of 1943, issued by the United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union, and the Potsdam Declaration of 1945, issued by the United States, Great Britain, and China, and later adhered to by the Soviet Union, addressed the issue of punishing war crimes committed by the German and Japanese governments, respectively. At the war's conclusion, representatives of the United States, the United Kingdom, the Soviet Union, and the Provisional Government of France signed the London Agreement, which provided for an international military tribunal to try major Axis war criminals whose offenses did not take place in specific geographic locations. This agreement was supported by 19 other governments and included the Nuremberg Charter, which established the Nuremberg Tribunal and categorized the offenses within its jurisdiction. The Charter listed 3 categories of crime: 1. Crimes against peace, which involved the preparation and initiation of a war of aggression; 2. War crimes, or conventional war crimes, which included murder, ill-treatment, and deportation; and 3. Crimes against humanity, which included political, racial, and religious persecution of civilians. This last category included what is commonly called genocide. The term genocide was coined by the Polish-American legal scholar Raphael Lemkin and first appeared in print in his work Axis Rule in Occupied Europe, Laws of Occupation, Analysis of Government, Proposals for Redress, 1944. The Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, adopted by the General Assembly of the United Nations in 1948, defined genocide as including killing or inflicting serious physical or mental injury on members of a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group with the intention of bringing about the group's destruction, in whole or in part. The convention made genocide an international crime that could be prosecuted in the court of any country. Because the Nuremberg trials preceded the convention, however, Nazi war criminals were not prosecuted for genocide. The International Military Tribunal in Nuremberg, Germany, tried 22 Nazi leaders, including one, Martin Bormann, who was tried in absentia. The trial was conducted in 4 languages and lasted nearly 11 months. All but 3 of the defendants were convicted, 12 were sentenced to death. The remaining defendants received lengthy prison terms, which they served at Spandau prison in West Berlin. Subsequent trials were held under the auspices of Control Council Law No. 10, which was used to prosecute accused Nazi war criminals whose crimes took place in specific locales. Japanese defendants accused of war crimes were tried by the International Military Tribunal for the Far East, which was established by a charter issued by U.S. Army General Douglas MacArthur. The so-called Tokyo Charter closely followed the Nuremberg Charter. The trials were conducted in English and Japanese and lasted nearly 2 years. Of the 25 Japanese defendants, all of whom were convicted, 7 were sentenced to hang, 16 were given life imprisonment, and 2 were sentenced to lesser terms. Except for those who died early of natural causes in prison, none of the imprisoned Japanese war criminals served a life sentence. Instead, by 1958 the remaining prisoners had been either pardoned or paroled. From their outset, the war crimes trials were dismissed by critics merely as victor's justice, because only individuals from defeated countries were prosecuted and because the defendants were charged with acts that allegedly had not been criminal when committed. In support of the trials, the Nuremberg Tribunal cited the Kellogg-Briand Pact, 1928, which formally outlawed war and made the initiation of war a crime for which individuals could be prosecuted. After the Nuremberg and Tokyo trials, numerous international treaties and conventions attempted to devise a comprehensive and enforceable definition of war crimes. The 4 separate Geneva Conventions, adopted in 1949, in theory made prosecutable certain acts committed in violation of the laws of war. The conventions provided for the protection of wounded, sick, and shipwrecked military personnel, prisoners of war, and civilians. Like the Convention on Genocide, however, the Geneva Convention specified that trials were to be arranged by individual governments. In 1977 2 protocols were adopted to clarify and supplement the Geneva Conventions. Recognizing that many conflicts were internal rather than international in scope, the second protocol afforded greater protection to guerrilla combatants in civil wars or wars of self-determination. Nearly 50 years passed between the Nuremberg and Tokyo trials and the next formal international prosecution of war crimes. In May 1993, in an attempt to prevent further acts of ethnic cleansing in the conflict between states of the former Yugoslavia and to restore peace and security to the Balkan region, the United Nations Security Council established the International Criminal Tribunal for the prosecution of persons responsible for serious violations of international humanitarian law committed in the territory of the former Yugoslavia since 1991, commonly known as the ICTY. In November 1994 the UN responded to charges of genocide in Rwanda by creating the ICTR, formerly known as the International Criminal Tribunal for the prosecution of persons responsible for genocide and other serious violations of international humanitarian law committed in the territory of Rwanda and Rwandan citizens responsible for genocide and other such violations committed in the territory of neighboring states between January 1 and December 31, 1994. Both the ICTY and ICTR were international in composition, and neither tribunal sat in the country where the covered conflict occurred. The ICTY was located in The Hague, and the ICTR was located in Arusha, Tanzania. The tribunals had nearly identical governing statutes and a common appellate chamber. Although the Nuremberg and Tokyo tribunals were empowered to impose capital punishment, the ICTR and ICTY could impose only terms of imprisonment. However, no centralized international prison system was established to house persons convicted of war crimes before the tribunals. The governing statutes of the ICTY and ICTR defined war crimes broadly. The ICTY was given jurisdiction over 4 categories of crime: 1. Grave breaches of the Geneva Conventions, 2. Violations of the laws or customs of war, 3. Genocide, and 4. Crimes against humanity. Recognizing that crimes against humanity do not necessarily involve a nexus to armed conflict, and taking into account legislation specifically enacted by the Rwandan government, the statute of the ICTR limited the jurisdiction of the tribunal to Rwandan leaders, while lower-level defendants were to be tried in domestic courts. In both tribunals rape, murder, torture, deportation, and enslavement were subject to prosecution. The tribunals thus were among the first international bodies to recognize sexual violence formally as a war crime. Like the statutes of the Nuremberg and Tokyo tribunals, the ICTY and ICTR statutes did not consider the official position of an individual, including his position as head of state, to be a sufficient basis for avoiding or evading criminal culpability. Accordingly, in 1999 the ICTY indicted Slobodan Milosevic, the Serbian, 1989–97, and Yugoslav, 1997–2000, president, for war crimes, and in 2001 he was arrested and extradited to The Hague. Likewise, military and civilian leaders who knew or should have known that their subordinates were committing war crimes were subject to prosecution under the doctrine of command or superior responsibility. Finally, individuals who committed war crimes pursuant to government or military orders were not thereby relieved of criminal liability, though the existence of the order could be used as a mitigating factor. Thus, the rules adopted for the Nuremberg and Tokyo trials continued to influence later efforts to bring suspected war criminals to justice. In 1993 the Belgian legislature passed a controversial law giving its courts the right to try any individual accused of a war crime anywhere in the world. The law, which resulted in lengthy prison sentences for 2 Rwandan nuns found guilty of genocide and in judicial complaints against many world leaders, including Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon, Cuban press, Fidel Castro, and Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat, was invalidated by the International Court of Justice in 2002. The following year the law was repealed by the Belgian government and replaced by a law requiring that either the victim of the war crime or the accused be a Belgian citizen or resident. In 1998 in Rome some 150 countries attempted to establish a permanent international criminal court. The negotiations eventually resulted in the adoption by 120 countries of the Rome Statute, a treaty establishing an International Criminal Court, ICC, to be located permanently at The Hague. The statute provided the ICC with jurisdiction for the crimes of aggression, genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes. The court came into existence on July 1, 2002, and by 2019 the statute had been ratified by more than 120 countries. 3 of the permanent members of the UN Security Council, China, Russia, and the United States, however, had not approved it. World War II, conflict that involved virtually every part of the world during the years 1939–45. The war was in many respects a continuation, after an uneasy 20-year hiatus, of the disputes left unsettled by World War I. The principal belligerents were the Axis powers, Germany, Italy, and Japan, and the Allies, France, Great Britain, the United States, the Soviet Union, and China. After the war, these countries would become the 5 permanent members of the United Nations Security Council. The total nature of World War II meant that civilian populations not only contributed to the war effort but also became direct targets of aerial attack. Moreover, in 1941 the Nazi regime unleashed a war of extermination against Jews, Slavs, and other people deemed inferior by Hitler's ideology, while Stalinist Russia extended its campaign of terror against Ukrainians to the conquered Poles. The 5 crore deaths incurred in World War II make it the bloodiest conflict, as well as the largest war, in history. Along with World War I, World War II was one of the great watersheds of 20th-century geopolitical history. It resulted in the extension of the Soviet Union's power to nations of Eastern Europe, enabled a communist movement to eventually achieve power in China, and marked the decisive shift of power in the world away from the states of Western Europe and toward the United States and the Soviet Union. By the early part of 1939, the German dictator Adolf Hitler had become determined to invade and occupy Poland. Poland, for its part, had guarantees of French and British military support should it be attacked by Germany. Hitler intended to invade Poland anyway, but first he had to neutralize the possibility that the Soviet Union would resist the invasion of its western neighbor. Secret negotiations led on August 23 to 24 to the signing of the German-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact in Moscow. In a secret protocol of this pact, the Germans and the Soviets agreed that Poland should be divided between them, with the western third of the country going to Germany and the eastern two-thirds being taken over by the USSR. Having achieved this cynical agreement, the other provisions of which stupefied Europe even without divulgence of the secret protocol, Hitler thought that Germany could attack Poland with no danger of Soviet or British intervention and gave orders for the invasion to start on August 26. News of the signing, on August 25, of a formal treaty of mutual assistance between Great Britain and Poland, to supersede a previous though temporary agreement, caused him to postpone the start of hostilities for a few days. He was still determined, however, to ignore the diplomatic efforts of the Western powers to restrain him. Finally, at 12:40 p.m. on August 31, 1939, Hitler ordered hostilities against Poland to start at 4:45 the next morning. The invasion began as ordered. In response, Great Britain and France declared war on Germany on September 3, at 11 a.m. and at 5 p.m., respectively. World War II had begun. In September 1939 the Allies, namely Great Britain, France, and Poland, were together superior in industrial resources, population, and military manpower, but the German military, or Wehrmacht, because of its armament, training, doctrine, discipline, and fighting spirit, was the most efficient and effective fighting force for its size in the world. The index of military strength in September 1939 was the number of divisions that each nation could mobilize. Against Germany's 100 infantry divisions and 6 armored divisions, France had 90 infantry divisions in metropolitan France, Great Britain had 10 infantry divisions, and Poland had 30 infantry divisions, 12 cavalry brigades, and 1 armored brigade. Poland had also 30 reserve infantry divisions, but these could not be mobilized quickly. A division contained from 12,000 to 25,000 men. It was the qualitative superiority of the German infantry divisions and the number of their armored divisions that made the difference in 1939. The firepower of a German infantry division far exceeded that of a French, British, or Polish division. The standard German division included 442 machine guns, 135 mortars, 72 anti-tank guns, and 24 howitzers. Allied divisions had a firepower only slightly greater than that of World War I. Germany had 6 armored divisions in September 1939. The Allies, though they had a large number of tanks, had no armored divisions at that time. The 6 armored, or Panzer, divisions of the Wehrmacht comprised some 2,400 tanks. And though Germany would subsequently expand its tank forces during the first years of the war, it was not the number of tanks that Germany had. The Allies had almost as many in September 1939, but the fact of their being organized into divisions and operated as such that was to prove decisive. In accordance with the doctrines of General Heinz Guderian, the German tanks were used in massed formations in conjunction with motorized artillery to punch holes in the enemy line and to isolate segments of the enemy, which were then surrounded and captured by motorized German infantry divisions while the tanks ranged forward to repeat the process. Deep drives into enemy territory by panzer divisions were thus followed by mechanized infantry and foot soldiers. These tactics were supported by dive bombers that attacked and disrupted the enemy's supply and communications lines and spread panic and confusion in its rear, thus further paralyzing its defensive capabilities. Mechanization was the key to the German Blitzkrieg, or lightning war, so named because of the unprecedented speed and mobility that were its salient characteristics. Tested and well-trained in maneuvers, the German panzer divisions constituted a force with no equal in Europe. The German Air Force, or Luftwaffe, was also the best force of its kind in 1939. It was a ground cooperation force designed to support the army, but its planes were superior to nearly all Allied types. In the rearmament period from 1935 to 1939, the production of German combat aircraft steadily mounted. The table shows the production of German aircraft by years. The standardization of engines and airframes gave the Luftwaffe an advantage over its opponents. Germany had an operational force of 1,000 fighters and 1,050 bombers in September 1939. The Allies actually had more planes in 1939 than Germany did, but their strength was made up of many different types, some of them obsolescent. The corresponding table shows the number of first-line military aircraft available to the Allies at the outbreak of war. Great Britain, which was held back by delays in the rearmament program, was producing one modern fighter in 1939, the Hurricane. A higher performance fighter, the Spitfire, was just coming into production and did not enter the air war in numbers until 1940. The value of the French Air Force in 1939 was reduced by the number of obsolescent planes in its order of battle, 131 of the 634 fighters and nearly all of the 463 bombers. France was desperately trying to buy high-performance aircraft in the United States in 1939. At sea, the odds against Germany were much greater in September 1939 than in August 1914, since the Allies in 1939 had many more large surface warships than Germany had. At sea, however, there was to be no clash between the Allied and the German massed fleets but only the individual operation of German pocket battleships and commerce raiders. The German conquest of Poland in September 1939 was the first demonstration in war of the new theory of high-speed armored warfare that had been adopted by the Germans when their rearmament began. Poland was a country all too well suited for such a demonstration. Its frontiers were immensely long, about 3,500 miles in all, and the stretch of 1,250 miles adjoining German territory had recently been extended to 1,750 miles in all by the German occupation of Bohemia, Moravia and of Slovakia, so that Poland's southern flank became exposed to invasion, as the northern flank, facing East Prussia, already was. Western Poland had become a huge salient that lay between Germany's jaws. It would have been wiser for the Polish army to assemble farther back, behind the natural defense line formed by the Vistula and San rivers, but that would have entailed the abandonment of some of the most valuable western parts of the country, including the Silesian coalfields and most of the main industrial zone, which lay west of the river barrier. The economic argument for delaying the German approach to the main industrial zone was heavily reinforced by Polish national pride and military overconfidence. When war broke out, the Polish army was able to mobilize about 1 million men, a fairly large number. The Polish army was woefully outmoded, however, and was almost completely lacking in tanks, armored personnel carriers, and anti-tank and anti-aircraft guns. Yet many of the Polish military leaders clung to the double belief that their preponderance of horsed cavalry was an important asset and that they could take the offensive against the German mechanized forces. They also tended to discount the effect of Germany's vastly superior air force, which was nearly 10 times as powerful as their own. The unrealism of such an attitude was repeated in the Polish army's dispositions. Approximately one-third of Poland's forces were concentrated in or near the Polish corridor, in northeastern Poland, where they were perilously exposed to a double envelopment, from East Prussia and the West combined. In the south, facing the main avenues of a German advance, the Polish forces were thinly spread. At the same time, nearly another one-third of Poland's forces were massed in reserve in the north-central part of the country, between Lodz and Warsaw, under the commander-in-chief, Marshal Edward Rydz Śmigły. The Poles' forward concentration in general forfeited their chance of fighting a series of delaying actions, since their foot-marching army was unable to retreat to their defensive positions in the rear or to man them before being overrun by the invaders' mechanized columns. The 40-odd infantry divisions employed by the Germans in the invasion counted for much less than their 14 mechanized or partially mechanized divisions. These consisted of 6 armored divisions, 4 light divisions, consisting of motorized infantry, infantry wholly transported by trucks and personnel carriers, with 2 armored units, and 4 motorized divisions. The Germans attacked with about 1,500,000 troops in all. It was the deep and rapid thrusts of these mechanized forces that decided the issue, in conjunction with the overhead pressure of the Luftwaffe, which wrecked the Polish railway system and destroyed most of the Polish air force before it could come into action. The Luftwaffe's terror bombing of Polish cities, bridges, roads, rail lines, and power stations completed the disorganization of the Polish defenses. On September 1, 1939, the German attack began. Against northern Poland, General Fedor von Bock commanded an army group comprising General George von Kuckler's Third Army, which struck southward from East Prussia, and General Gunther von Kluge's Fourth Army, which struck eastward across the base of the corridor. Much stronger in troops and in tanks, however, was the army group in the south under General Gerd von Rundstedt, attacking from Silesia and from the Moravian and Slovakian border. General Johannes Blaskowitz's 8th Army, on the left, was to drive eastward against Lodz. General Wilhelm List's 14th Army, on the right, was to push on toward Krakow and to turn the Poles' Carpathian flank, and General Walther von Reichenau's 10th Army, in the center, with the bulk of the group's armor, was to deliver the decisive blow with a northwestward thrust into the heart of Poland. By September 3, when Kluge in the north had reached the Vistula and Kuckler was approaching the Nera River, Reichenau's armor was already beyond the Warta. 2 days later his left wing was well to the rear of Lodz and his right wing at Kielce, and by September 8 one of his armored corps was in the outskirts of Warsaw, having advanced 140 miles in the first week of war. Light divisions on Reichenau's right were on the Vistula between Warsaw and Sandomierz by September 9, while List, in the south, was on the San above and below Przemysl. At the same time, the Third Army tanks, led by Guderian, were across the Narew attacking the line of the Bug River, behind Warsaw. All the German armies had made progress in fulfilling their parts in the great enveloping maneuver planned by General Franz Halder, Chief of the General Staff, and directed by General Walther von Brauchitsch, the Commander-in-Chief. The Polish armies were splitting up into uncoordinated fragments, some of which were retreating while others were delivering disjointed attacks on the nearest German columns. On September 10 the Polish Commander-in-Chief, Marshal Edward Rydz Smigli, ordered a general retreat to the southeast. The Germans, however, were by that time not only tightening their net around the Polish forces west of the Vistula, in the Lodz area and, still farther west, around Poznan, but also penetrating deeply into eastern Poland. The Polish defense was already reduced to random efforts by isolated bodies of troops when another blow fell. On September 17, 1939, Soviet forces entered Poland from the east. The next day, the Polish government and high command crossed the Romanian frontier on their way into exile. The Warsaw garrison held out against the Germans until September 28, undergoing terror bombings and artillery barrages that reduced parts of the city to rubble, with no regard for the civilian population. The last considerable fragment of the Polish army resisted until October 5, and some guerrilla fighting went on into the winter. The Germans took a total of 700,000 prisoners, and about 80,000 Polish soldiers escaped over neutral frontiers. Approximately 70,000 Polish soldiers were killed and more than 130,000 wounded during the battle, whereas the Germans sustained about 45,000 total casualties. Poland was conquered for partition between Germany and the USSR, the forces of which met and greeted each other on Polish soil. On September 28 another secret German, Soviet protocol modified the arrangements of August. All Lithuania was to be a Soviet sphere of influence, not a German one, but the dividing line in Poland was changed in Germany's favor, being moved eastward to the Bug River. Profiting quickly from its understanding with Germany, the USSR on October 10, 1939, constrained Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania to admit Soviet garrisons onto their territories. Approached with similar demands, Finland refused to comply, even though the USSR offered territorial compensation elsewhere for the cessions that it was requiring for its own strategic reasons. Finland's armed forces amounted to about 200,000 troops in 10 divisions. The Soviets eventually brought about 70 divisions, about 1 million men, to bear in their attack on Finland, along with about 1,000 tanks. Soviet troops attacked Finland on November 30, 1939. The invaders succeeded in isolating the little Arctic port of Petsamo in the far north but were ignominiously repulsed on all of the fronts chosen for their advance. On the Karelian Isthmus, the massive reinforced concrete fortifications of Finland's Mannerheim line blocked the Soviet forces' direct land route from Leningrad into Finland. The Soviet planners had grossly underestimated the Finns' national will to resist and the natural obstacles constituted by the terrain's numerous lakes and forests. The Western powers exulted overtly over the humiliation of the Soviet Union. One important effect of Finland's early successes was to reinforce the tendency of both Hitler and the Western democracies to underestimate the Soviet military capabilities. But in the meantime, the Soviet strategists digested their hard-learned military lessons. On February 1, 1940, the Red Army launched 14 divisions into a major assault on the Mannerheim Line. The offensive's weight was concentrated along a 10-mile sector of the line near Suma, which was pounded by a tremendous artillery bombardment. As the fortifications were pulverized, tanks and sledge-carried infantry advanced to occupy the ground while the Soviet Air Force broke up attempted Finnish counterattacks. After little more than a fortnight of this methodical process, a breach was made through the whole depth of the Mannerheim Line. Once the Soviets had forced a passage on the Karelian Isthmus, Finland's eventual collapse was certain. On March 6 Finland sued for peace, and a week later the Soviet terms were accepted. The Finns had to cede the entire Karelian Isthmus, Viipuri, and their part of the Rybaki Peninsula to the Soviets. The Finns had suffered about 70,000 casualties in the campaign, the Soviets more than 2 lakh. During their campaign in Poland, the Germans kept only 23 divisions in the west to guard their frontier against the French, who had nearly 5 times as many divisions mobilized. The French commander-in-chief, General Maurice Gustave Gamelin, proposed an advance against Germany through neutral Belgium and the Netherlands in order to have room to exercise his ponderous military machine. He was overruled, however, and French assaults on the 100-mile stretch of available front along the Franco-German frontier had barely dented the German defenses when the collapse of Poland prompted the recall of Gamelin's advanced divisions to defensive positions in the Maginot Line. From October 1939 to March 1940, successive plans were developed for counteraction in the event of a German offensive through Belgium, all of them based on the assumption that the Germans would come across the plain north of Namur, not across the hilly and wooded Ardennes. The Germans would indeed have taken the route foreseen by the French if Hitler's desire for an offensive in November 1939 had not been frustrated, on the one hand, by bad weather and, on the other, by the hesitations of his generals. But in March 1940 the bold suggestion of General Erich von Manstein that an offensive through the Ardennes should, in fact, be practicable for tank forces was adopted by Hitler, despite orthodox military opinion. Meanwhile, Hitler's immediate outlook had been changed by considerations about Scandinavia. Originally he had intended to respect Norway's neutrality. Then rumors leaked out, prematurely, of British designs on Norway, as, in fact, Winston Churchill, First Lord of the Admiralty, was arguing that mines should be laid in Norwegian waters to stop the export of Swedish iron ore from Gallivare to Germany through Norway's rail terminus and port of Narvik. The British cabinet, in response to Churchill, authorized at least the preparation of a plan for a landing at Narvik, and in mid-December 1939 a Norwegian politician, Vidkun Quisling, leader of a pro-Nazi party, was introduced to Hitler. On January 27, 1940, Hitler ordered plans for an invasion of Norway, for use if he could no longer respect Norway's neutrality. After France's failure to interrupt the German conquest of Poland, the Western powers and the Germans were so inactive with regard to land operations that journalists began to speak derisively, over the next 6 months, of the phony war. At sea, however, the period was somewhat more eventful. German U-boats sank the British aircraft carrier Courageous, September 17, and the battleship Royal Oak, October 14. The U-boats' main warfare, however, was against merchant shipping. They sank more than 110 vessels in the first 4 months of the war. Both the Germans and the British, meanwhile, were engaged in extensive mine-laying. In surface warfare at sea, the British were on the whole more fortunate than the Germans. A German pocket battleship in the Atlantic, the Admiral Graf Spee sank 9 ships before coming to a tragic end, having sustained and inflicted damage in an engagement with 3 British cruisers off the Rio de la Plata on December 13, 1939, she made off to Montevideo and obtained leave to spend 4 days there for repairs. The British mustered reinforcements for the 2 cruisers still capable of action after the engagement, namely the Ajax and the Achilles, and brought the Cumberland to the scene in time, but, on December 17, when the Graf Spee put to sea again, her crew scuttled her a little way out of the harbor before the fight could be resumed. British plans for landings on the Norwegian coast in the third week of March 1940 were temporarily postponed. Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, however, was by that time convinced that some aggressive action ought to be taken, and Paul Reynaud, who succeeded Edouard Daladier as France's premier on March 21, was of the same opinion. Reynaud had come into office on the surge of the French public's demand for a more aggressive military policy and quicker offensive action against Germany. It was agreed that mines should be laid in Norwegian waters and that the mining should be followed by the landing of troops at 4 Norwegian ports, Narvik, Trondheim, Bergen, and Stavanger. Because of Anglo-French arguments, the date of the mining was postponed from April 5 to April 8. The postponement was catastrophic. Hitler had on April 1 ordered the German invasion of Norway to begin on April 9, so, when on April 8 the Norwegian government was preoccupied with earnest protest about the British mine-laying, the German expeditions were well on their way. On April 9, 1940, the major Norwegian ports from Oslo northward to Narvik, 1,200 miles away from Germany's naval bases, were occupied by advanced detachments of German troops. At the same time, a single parachute battalion, the first ever employed in warfare, took the Oslo and Stavanger airfields, and 800 operational aircraft overawed the Norwegian population. Norwegian resistance at Narvik, at Trondheim, the strategic key to Norway, at Bergen, at Stavanger, and at Kristiansand had been overcome very quickly, and Oslo's effective resistance to the seaborne forces was nullified when German troops from the airfield entered the city. Simultaneously, along with their Norwegian enterprise, the Germans on April 9 occupied Denmark, sending troopships, covered by aircraft, into Copenhagen harbor and marching over the land frontier into Jutland. This occupation was obviously necessary for the safety of their communications with Norway. Allied troops began to land at Narvik on April 14. Shortly afterward, British troops were landed also at Namsos and at Andelsens, to attack Trondheim from the north and from the south, respectively. The Germans, however, landed fresh troops in the rear of the British at Namsos and advanced up the Gudbrandsdal from Oslo against the force at Andelsens. By this time the Germans had about 25,000 troops in Norway. By May 2, both Namsos and Andelsens were evacuated by the British. The Germans at Narvik held out against 5 times as many British and French troops until May 27. By that time the German offensive in France had progressed to such an extent that the British could no longer afford any commitment in Norway, and the 25,000 Allied troops were evacuated from Narvik 10 days after their victory. The Norwegian King Haakon VII and his government left Norway for Britain at the same time. Hitler garrisoned Norway with about 300,000 troops for the rest of the war. By occupying Norway, Hitler had ensured the protection of Germany's supply of iron ore from Sweden and had obtained naval and air bases with which to strike at Britain if necessary. What was to happen in Norway became a less important question for the Western powers when, on May 10, 1940, they were surprised by Hitler's long-debated stroke against them through the Low Countries. France's 800,000-man standing army was thought at the time to be the most powerful in Europe. But the French had not progressed beyond the defensive mentality inherited from World War I, and they relied primarily on their Maginot Line for protection against a German offensive. The Maginot Line was an extremely well-developed chain of fortifications running from the Swiss frontier opposite Basel northward along the left bank of the Rhine and then northwestward no farther than Montmedy, near the Belgian frontier south of the Ardennes forest. The line consisted of a series of giant pillboxes and other defensive installations constructed in depth, equipped with underground supply and communications facilities, and connected by rail lines, with all its heavy guns pointed east at the German frontier. Depending heavily on the line as a defense against German attack, the French had 41 divisions manning it or backing it, whereas only 39 divisions were watching the long stretch of frontier north of it, from Montmedy through the Ardennes and across Flanders to the English Channel. In their plan for the invasion of France and the Low Countries, the Germans kept General Wilhelm von Leib's Army Group C facing the Maginot Line so as to deter the French from diverting forces from it, while launching Bach's Army Group B into the basin of the lower Maas River north of Liège and Rundstedt's Army Group A into the Ardennes. Army Group B comprised Kuckeler's 18th Army, with 1 armored division and airborne support, to attack the Netherlands, and Reichenau's 6th, with 2 armored divisions, to advance over the Belgian plain. These 2 armies would have to deal not only with the Dutch and Belgian armies but also with the forces that the Allies, according to their plan, would send into the Low Countries, namely 2 French armies and 9 British divisions. Rundstedt's Army Group A, however, was much stronger, comprising as it did Kluge's 4th Army, List's 12th, and General Ernst Busch's 16th, with General Maximilian von Weichsel's 2nd in reserve, besides a large armored group under Paul Ludwig von Kleist and a smaller one under General Hermann Hoth, and amounting in all to 44 divisions, 7 of them armored, with 27 divisions in reserve. Army Group A thus amounted to more than 1,500,000 men and more than 1,500 tanks, and it would strike at the weak hinge of the Allies' will into Belgium, that is to say, at 2 French armies, General Charles Hunsiger's 2nd and General André Corrup's 9th, which together mustered only 12 infantry and 4 horsed cavalry divisions and stood, respectively, east and west of Sedan on the least fortified stretch of the French frontier. Against this weak center of the Allied line were thus massed nearly 2/3 of Germany's forces in the west and nearly 3/4 of its tank forces. The Dutch army comprised 10 divisions and the equivalent of 10 more in smaller formations, and thus totaled more than 400,000 men. It apparently had a good chance of withstanding the German invasion, since the attacking German army comprised only 7 divisions, apart from the airborne forces it would use. The Dutch, however, had a wide front, a very sensitive and loosely settled rear, very few tanks, and no experience of modern warfare. On May 10, the German attack on the Netherlands began with the capture by parachutists of the bridges at Moordijk, at Dordrecht, and at Rotterdam, and with landings on the airfields around The Hague. On the same day, the weakly held Peel line, south of the westward turning Arc of the Maas, was penetrated by the German land forces, and on May 11 the Dutch defenders fell back westward past Tilburg to Breda, with the consequence that the French 7th Army, under General Henri Giroux, whose leading forces had sped forward across Belgium over the 140 miles to Tilburg, fell back to Breda likewise. The German tanks thus had a clear road to Moordijk, and by noon on May 12 they were in the outskirts of Rotterdam. North of the Maas, meanwhile, where the bulk of the Dutch defense was concentrated, the Germans achieved a narrow breach of the Geld Valley line on May 12, whereupon the Dutch, unable to counterattack, retreated to the Fortress of Holland line protecting Utrecht and Amsterdam. Queen Wilhelmina and her government left the country for England on May 13, and the next day the Dutch commander-in-chief, General Henri Gerard Winkelmann, surrendered to the Germans, who had threatened to bomb Rotterdam and Utrecht, as places in the front line of the fighting, if resistance continued. In fact, Rotterdam was bombed, after the capitulation, by 30 planes through a mistake in the German signal communications. The news of the German onslaught in the Low Countries, dismaying as it was to the Allies, had one effect that was to be of momentous importance to their fortunes. Chamberlain, whose half-hearted conduct of the war had been bitterly criticized in the House of Commons during the debate of May 7 to 8 on the campaign in Norway, resigned office in the evening of May 10 and was succeeded as Prime Minister by Churchill, who formed a coalition government. For the first phase of the invasion of the Belgian plain north of Liège, Reichenau had 4 army corps, 1 armored corps, and only 500 airborne troops. Italy had been unprepared for war when Hitler attacked Poland, but if the Italian leader, Benito Mussolini, was to reap any positive advantages from partnership with Hitler, it seemed that Italy would have to abandon its non-belligerent stance before the Western democracies had been defeated by Germany single-handed. The obvious collapse of France convinced Mussolini that the time to implement his Pact of Steel with Hitler had come, and on June 10, 1940, Italy declared war against France and Great Britain. With about 30 divisions available on their Alpine frontier, the Italians delayed their actual attack on southeastern France until June 20, but it achieved little against the local defense. In any case, the issue in France had already been virtually settled by the victory of Italy's German ally. Meanwhile, Reynaud had left Paris for Cannes, near Tours, and Végan, after speaking frankly and despondently to Churchill at the Allied military headquarters at Briare on June 11, told Reynaud and the other ministers at Cannes on June 12 that the battle for France was lost and that a cessation of hostilities was compulsory. There was little doubt that he was correct in this estimate of the military situation. The French armies were now splitting up into fragments. Reynaud's government was divided between the advocates of capitulation and those who, with Reynaud, wanted to continue the war from French North Africa. The only decision that it could make was to move itself from Tours to Bordeaux. The Germans entered Paris on June 14, 1940, and were driving still deeper southward along both the western and eastern edges of France. 2 days later they were in the Rhône Valley. Meanwhile, Bigon was still pressing for an armistice, backed by all the principal commanders. Reynaud resigned office on June 16, whereupon a new government was formed by Marshal Philippe Pétain, the revered and aged hero of the Battle of Verdun in World War I. In the night of June 16 the French request for an armistice was transmitted to Hitler. While discussion of the terms went on, the German advance went on too. Finally, on June 22, 1940, at Ratonde, the scene of the signing of the Armistice of 1918, the new Franco-German armistice was signed. The Franco-Italian armistice was signed on June 24. Both armistices came into effect early on June 25. The armistice of June 22 divided France into two zones, one to be under German military occupation and one to be left to the French in full sovereignty. The occupied zone comprised all northern France from the northwestern frontier of Switzerland to the Channel and from the Belgian and German frontiers to the Atlantic, together with a strip extending from the lower Loire southward along the Atlantic coast to the western end of the Pyrenees. The unoccupied zone comprised only 2/5 of France's territory, the southeast. The French Navy and Air Force were to be neutralized, but it was not required that they be handed over to the Germans. The Italians granted very generous terms to the French. The only French territory that they claimed to occupy was the small frontier tract that their forces had succeeded in overrunning since June 20. Meanwhile, from June 18, General Charles de Gaulle, whom Reynaud had sent on a military mission to London on June 5, was broadcasting appeals for the continuance of France's war. The collapse of France in June 1940 posed a severe naval problem to the British, because the powerful French navy still existed. Strategically, it was of immense importance to the British that these French ships not fall into German hands, since they would have tilted the balance of sea power decidedly in favor of the Axis, the Italian navy being now also at war with Britain. Mistrustful of promises that the French ships would be used only for supervision and minesweeping, the British decided to immobilize them. Thus, on July 3, 1940, the British seized all French ships in British-controlled ports, encountering only nominal resistance. But when British ships appeared off Mers el-Kabir, near Oran on the Algerian coast, and demanded that the ships of the important French naval force there either join the Allies or sail out to sea, the French refused to submit, and the British eventually opened fire, damaging the battleship Dunkirk, destroying the Bretagne, and disabling several other vessels. Thereupon, Pétain's government, which on July 1 had installed itself at Vichy, on July 4 severed diplomatic relations with the British. In the 8 following days, the constitution of France's Third Republic was abolished and a new French state created, under the supreme authority of Pétain himself. The few French colonies that rallied to General de Gaulle's Free French movement were strategically unimportant. With France conquered, Hitler could now turn his forces on Germany's sole remaining enemy, Great Britain, which was protected from the formidable German army by the waters of the English Channel. On July 16, 1940, Hitler issued a directive ordering the preparation and, if necessary, the execution of a plan for the invasion of Great Britain. But an amphibious invasion of Britain would only be possible, given Britain's large navy, if Germany could establish control of the air in the battle zone. To this end, the Luftwaffe chief, Göring, on August 2 issued the Eagle Day Directive, laying down a plan of attack in which a few massive blows from the air were to destroy British air power and so open the way for the amphibious invasion, termed Operation Sea Lion. Victory in the air battle for the Luftwaffe would indeed have exposed Great Britain to invasion and occupation. The victory by the Royal Air Force, RAF, Fighter Command blocked this possibility and, in fact, created the conditions for Great Britain's survival, for the extension of the war, and for the eventual defeat of Nazi Germany. The forces engaged in the battle were relatively small. The British disposed some 600 frontline fighters to defend the country. The Germans made available about 1,300 bombers and dive bombers, and about 900 single-engined and 300 twin-engined fighters. These were based in an arc around England from Norway to the Cherbourg Peninsula in northern coastal France. The preliminaries of the Battle of Britain occupied June and July 1940, the climax August and September, and the aftermath, the so-called Blitz, the winter of 1940–41. In the campaign, the Luftwaffe had no systematic or consistent plan of action. Sometimes it tried to establish a blockade by the destruction of British shipping and ports, sometimes, to destroy Britain's fighter command by combat and by the bombing of ground installations, and sometimes, to seek direct strategic results by attacks on London and other populous centres of industrial or political significance. The British, on the other hand, had prepared themselves for the kind of battle that in fact took place. Their radar early warning, the most advanced and the most operationally adapted system in the world, gave fighter command adequate notice of where and when to direct their fighter forces to repel German bombing raids. The Spitfire, moreover, though still in short supply, was unsurpassed as an interceptor by any fighter in any other air force. The British fought not only with the advantage, unusual for them, of superior equipment and undivided aim but also against an enemy divided in object and condemned by circumstance and by lack of forethought to fight at a tactical disadvantage. The German bombers lacked the bomb load capacity to strike permanently devastating blows and also proved, in daylight, to be easily vulnerable to the Spitfires and Hurricanes. Britain's radar, moreover, largely prevented them from exploiting the element of surprise. The German dive bombers were even more vulnerable to being shot down by British fighters, and long-range fighter cover was only partially available from German fighter aircraft, since the latter were operating at the limit of their flying range. The German air attacks began on ports and airfields along the English Channel, where convoys were bombed and the air battle was joined. In June and July 1940, as the Germans gradually redeployed their forces, the air battle moved inland over the interior of Britain. On August 8 the intensive phase began, when the Germans launched bombing raids involving up to nearly 1,500 aircraft a day and directed them against the British fighter airfields and radar stations. In 4 actions, on August 8, 11, 12, and 13, the Germans lost 145 aircraft as against the British loss of 88. By late August the Germans had lost more than 600 aircraft, the RAF only 260, but the RAF was losing badly needed fighters and experienced pilots at too great a rate, and its effectiveness was further hampered by bombing damage done to the radar stations. At the beginning of September the British retaliated by unexpectedly launching a bombing raid on Berlin, which so infuriated Hitler that he ordered the Luftwaffe to shift its attacks from fighter command installations to London and other cities. These assaults on London, Coventry, Liverpool, and other cities went on unabated for several months. But already, by September 15, on which day the British believed, albeit incorrectly, that they had scored their greatest success by destroying 185 German aircraft, fighter command had demonstrated to the Luftwaffe that it could not gain air ascendancy over Britain. This was because British fighters were simply shooting down German bombers faster than German industry could produce them. The Battle of Britain was thus won, and the invasion of England was postponed indefinitely by Hitler. The British had lost more than 900 fighters but had shot down about 1,700 German aircraft. During the following winter, the Luftwaffe maintained a bombing offensive, carrying out night bombing attacks on Britain's larger cities. By February 1941 the offensive had declined. But in March and April there was a revival, and nearly 10,000 sorties were flown, with heavy attacks made on London. Thereafter German strategic air operations over England withered. The continued resistance of the British caused Hitler once more to change his timetable. His great design for a campaign against the USSR had originally been scheduled to begin about 1943, by which time he should have secured the German position on the rest of the European continent by a series of localized campaigns and have reached some sort of compromise with Great Britain. But in July 1940, seeing Great Britain still undefeated and the United States increasingly inimical to Germany, he decided that the conquest of the European part of the Soviet Union must be undertaken in May 1941 in order both to demonstrate Germany's invincibility to Great Britain and to deter the United States from intervention in Europe, because the elimination of the USSR would strengthen the Japanese position in the Far East and in the Pacific. Events in the interval, however, were to make him change his plan once again. While the invasion of the USSR was being prepared, Hitler was much concerned to extend German influence across Slovakia and Hungary into Romania, the oil fields of which he was anxious to secure against Soviet attack and the military manpower of which might be joined to the forces of the German coalition. In May 1940 he obtained an oil and arms pact from Romania, but, when Romania, after being constrained by a Soviet ultimatum in June to cede Bessarabia and northern Bukovina to the USSR, requested a German military mission and a German guarantee of its remaining frontiers, Hitler refused to comply until the claims of other states against Romania had been met. Romania was compelled to cede southern Dobruja to Bulgaria on August 21, but its negotiations with Hungary about Transylvania were broken off on August 23. Since, if war had broken out between Romania and Hungary, the USSR might have intervened and won control over the oil wells, Hitler decided to arbitrate immediately. By the Vienna Award of August 30, Germany and Italy assigned northern Transylvania, including the Sekler district, to Hungary, and Germany then guaranteed what was left of Romania. In the face of the Romanian nationalists' outcry against these proceedings, the king, Carol II, transferred his dictatorial powers to General Ion Antonescu on September 4, 1940, and abdicated his crown in favor of his young son Michael 2 days later. Antonescu had already repeated the request for a German military mission, which arrived in Bucharest on October 12. Though Hitler had apprised the Italian foreign minister, Galeazzo Ciano, of his intention to send a military mission to Romania, Ciano had not apprised Mussolini. So, since the latter's Balkan ambitions had been continually restrained by Hitler, particularly with regard to Yugoslavia, the sudden news of the mission annoyed him. On October 28, 1940, therefore, having given Hitler only the barest hints of his project, Mussolini launched 7 Italian divisions from Albania into a separate war of his own against Greece. The result was exasperating for Hitler. His allies' forces were not only halted by the Greeks, a few miles over the border, on November 8, 1940, but were also driven back by General Alexandros Papagos' counteroffensive of November 14, which was to put the Greeks in possession of 1/3 of Albania by mid-December. Moreover, British troops landed in Crete, and some British aircraft were sent to bases near Athens, whence they might have attacked the Romanian oil fields. Lastly, the success of the Greeks caused Yugoslavia and Bulgaria, who had hitherto been attentive to overtures from the Axis powers, to revert to a strictly neutral policy. Anticipating Mussolini's appeal for German help in his separate or parallel war, Hitler in November 1940 drew Hungary, Romania, and Slovakia successively into the Axis or tripartite pact that Germany, Italy, and Japan had concluded on September 27. See below Japanese policy, 1939-41. And he also obtained Romania's assent to the assembling of German troops in the south of Romania for an attack on Greece through Bulgaria. Hungary consented to the transit of these troops through its territory lest Romania take Hungary's place in Germany's favor and so be secured in possession of the Transylvanian lands left to it by the Vienna Award. Bulgaria, however, for fear of Soviet reaction, on the one hand, and of Turkish, on the other, Turkey had massed 28 divisions in Thrace when Italy attacked Greece, delayed its adhesion to the Axis until March 1, 1941. Only thereafter, on March 18, did the Yugoslav regent, Prince Paul, and his ministers Dragiša Svetković and Aleksandar Sinker-Marković agree to Yugoslavia's adhesion to the Axis. Meanwhile, the German 12th Army had crossed the Danube from Romania into Bulgaria on March 2, 1941. Consequently, in accordance with a Greco-British agreement of February 21, a British expeditionary force of 58,000 men from Egypt landed in Greece on March 7, to occupy the Olympus-Vermian line. Then, on March 27, 1941, 2 days after the Yugoslav government's signature, in Vienna, of its adhesion to the Axis Pact, a group of Yugoslav army officers, led by General Dusan Simovic, executed a coup d'état in Belgrade, overthrowing the regency in favor of the 17-year-old King Peter II and reversing the former government's policy. Almost simultaneously with the Belgrade coup d'état, the decisive Battle of Cape Matapan took place between the British and Italian fleets in the Mediterranean, off the Peloponnesian mainland northwest of Crete. Hitherto, Italo-British naval hostilities in the Mediterranean area since June 1940 had comprised only one noteworthy action, the sinking in November at the Italian naval base of Taranto of 3 battleships by aircraft from the British carrier Illustrious. In March 1941, however, some Italian naval forces, including the battleship Vittorio Veneto, with several cruisers and destroyers, set out to threaten British convoys to Greece, and British forces, including the battleships Warspite, Valiant, and Barham and the aircraft carrier Formidable, likewise with cruisers and destroyers, were sent to intercept them. When the forces met in the morning of March 28, off Cape Matapan, the Vittorio Veneto opened fire on the lighter British ships but was soon trying to escape from the engagement, for fear of the torpedo aircraft from the Formidable. The battle then became a pursuit, which lasted long into the night. Finally, though the severely damaged Vittorio Veneto made good her escape, the British sank 3 Italian cruisers and 2 destroyers. The Italian Navy made no more surface ventures into the eastern Mediterranean. The German attack on Greece, scheduled for April 1, 1941, was postponed for a few days when Hitler, because of the Belgrade coup d'état, decided that Yugoslavia was to be destroyed at the same time. While Great Britain's efforts to draw Yugoslavia into the Greco-British defensive system were fruitless, Germany began canvassing allies for its planned invasion of Yugoslavia and Greece. Italy agreed to collaborate in the attack, and Hungary and Bulgaria agreed to send troops to occupy the territories that they coveted as soon as the Germans should have destroyed the Yugoslav state. On April 6, 1941, the Germans, with 24 divisions and 1,200 tanks, invaded both Yugoslavia, which had 32 divisions, and Greece, which had 15 divisions. The operations were conducted in the same way as Germany's previous Blitzkrieg campaigns. While massive air raids struck Belgrade, List's 12th Army drove westward and southward from the Bulgarian frontiers, Kleist's armored group northwestward from Sofia, and Wakes's 2nd Army southward from Austria and from western Hungary. The 12th Armies advanced through Skopje to the Albanian border, cut communications between Yugoslavia and Greece in 2 days. Niš fell to Kleist on April 9, Zagreb to Wakes on April 10, and on April 11 the Italian 2nd Army, comprising 15 divisions, advanced from Istria into Dalmatia. After the fall of Belgrade to the German forces from bases in Romania, April 12, the remnant of the Yugoslav army, whose only offensive, in northern Albania, had collapsed, was encircled in Bosnia. Its capitulation was signed, in Belgrade, on April 17. In Greece, meanwhile, the Germans took Salonika, Thessaloniki, on April 9, 1941, and then initiated a drive toward Ioannina, Ioannina, thus severing communication between the bulk of the Greek army, which was on the Albanian frontier, and its rear. The isolated main body capitulated on April 20, the Greek army as a whole on April 22. 2 days later the pass of Thermopylae, defended by a British rear guard, was taken by the Germans, who entered Athens on April 27. All mainland Greece and all the Greek Aegean islands except Crete were under German occupation by May 11, the Ionian Islands under Italian. The remainder of Britain's 50,000-man force in Greece was hastily evacuated with great difficulty after leaving all of their tanks and other heavy equipment behind. The campaign against Yugoslavia brought 340,000 soldiers of the Yugoslav army into captivity as German prisoners of war. In the campaign against Greece the Germans took 220,000 Greek and 20,000 British or Commonwealth prisoners of war. The combined German losses in the Balkan campaigns were about 2,500 dead, 6,000 wounded, and 3,000 missing. German airborne troops began to land in Crete on May 20, 1941, at Malim, in the Kania Suda area, at Rethymnon, and at Heraklion. Fighting, on land and on the sea, with heavy losses on both sides, went on for a week before the Allied Commander-in-Chief, General Bernard Cyril Freyberg of the New Zealand Expeditionary Force, was authorized to evacuate the island. The last defenders were overwhelmed at Rethymnon on May 31. The prisoners of war taken by the Germans in Crete numbered more than 15,000 British or Commonwealth troops, besides the Greeks taken. In battles around the island, German air attacks sank 3 light cruisers and 6 destroyers of the British Mediterranean Fleet and damaged 3 battleships, 1 aircraft carrier, 6 light cruisers, and 5 destroyers. Both the Yugoslav and the Greek royal governments went into exile on their army's collapse. The Axis powers were left to dispose as they would of their conquests. Yugoslavia was completely dissolved. Croatia, the independence of which had been proclaimed on April 10, 1941, was expanded to form Great Croatia, which included Srem, Sirmia, the zone between the Sava and the Danube south of the Drava confluence, and Bosnia and Herzegovina. Most of Dalmatia was annexed to Italy. Montenegro was restored to independence. Yugoslav Macedonia was partitioned between Bulgaria and Albania. Slovenia was partitioned between Italy and Germany, the Baranja Triangle and the Bačka went to Hungary. The Banat and Serbia were put under German military administration. Of the independent states, Great Croatia, ruled by anti-Pavelikas nationalist Ustase, insurgents, and Montenegro were Italian spheres of influence, although German troops still occupied the eastern part of Great Croatia. A puppet government of Serbia was set up by the Germans in August 1941. While Bulgarian troops occupied eastern Macedonia and most of western Thrace, the rest of mainland Greece, theoretically subject to a puppet government in Athens, was militarily occupied by the Italians except for 3 zones, namely the Athens district, the Salonika district, and the Demotica strip of Thrace, which the German conquerors reserved for themselves. The Germans also remained in occupation of Lesbos, Chios, Samos, Melos, and Crete. The contemporary course of events in the Balkans, described above, nullified the first great victory won by British land forces in World War II, which took place in North Africa. When Italy declared war against Great Britain in June 1940, it had nearly 300,000 men under Marshal Rodolfo Graziani in Cyrenaica, present-day Libya, to confront the 36,000 troops whom the British commander-in-chief in the Middle East, General Sir Archibald Wavell, had in Egypt to protect the North African approaches to the Suez Canal. Between these forces lay the Western Desert, in which the westernmost position actually held by the British was Mersa Matruh, Marsa Mai, 120 miles east of the Cyrenaican frontier. The Italians in September 1940 occupied Sidi Barrani, 170 miles west of Mersa Matruh, but, after settling 6 divisions into a chain of widely separated camps, they did nothing more for weeks, and during that time Wavell received some reinforcements. Wavell, whose command included not only Egypt but also the East African fronts against the Italians, decided to strike first in North Africa. On December 7, 1940, some 30,000 men, under Major General Richard Nugent O'Connor, advanced westward, from Mersa Matruh, against 80,000 Italians, but, whereas the Italians at Sidi Barrani had only 120 tanks, O'Connor had 275. Having passed by night through a gap in the chain of forts, O'Connor's forces stormed 3 of the Italian camps, while the 7th Armored Division was already cutting the Italians' road of retreat along the coast to the west. On December 10 most of the positions closer to Sidi Barrani were overrun, and on December 11 the reserve tanks made a further enveloping bound to the coast beyond Bukbuk, intercepting a large column of retreating Italians. In 3 days the British had taken nearly 40,000 prisoners. Falling back across the frontier into Cyrenaica, the remnant of the Italian forces from Sidi Barrani shut itself up in the fortress of Bardia, which O'Connor's tanks speedily isolated. On January 3, 1941, the British assault on Bardia began, and 3 days later the whole garrison of Bardia surrendered, 45,000 men. The next fortress to the west, Tobruk, was assaulted on January 23 and captured the next day, 30,000 more prisoners. To complete their conquest of Cyrenaica, it remained for the British to take the port of Benghazi. On February 3, 1941, however, O'Connor learned that the Italians were about to abandon Benghazi and to retreat westward down the coast road to Agila, al-Ukaila. Thereupon he boldly ordered the 7th Armored Division to cross the desert hinterland and intercept the Italian retreat by cutting the coast road well to the east of Agila. On February 5, after an advance of 170 miles in 33 hours, the British were blocking the Italians' line of retreat south of Bay Fum, and in the morning of February 6, as the main Italian columns appeared, a day of battle began. Though the Italians had, altogether, nearly 4 times as many cruiser tanks as the British, by the following morning 60 Italian tanks had been crippled, 40 more abandoned, and the rest of Graziani's army was surrendering in crowds. The British, only 3,000 strong and having lost only 3 of their 29 tanks, took 20,000 prisoners, 120 tanks, and 216 guns. The British, having occupied Benghazi on February 6 and Agila on February 8, could now have pushed on without hindrance to Tripoli, but the chance was foregone. The Greek government had accepted Churchill's reiterated offer of British troops to be sent to Greece from Egypt, which meant a serious reduction of British strength in North Africa. The reduction was to have serious consequences, because on February 6, the very day of Beta Fam, a young general, Erwin Rommel, had been appointed by Hitler to command 2 German mechanized divisions that were to be sent as soon as possible to help the Italians. Arriving in Tripolitania, Rommel decided to try an offensive with what forces he had. Against the depleted British strength, he was rapidly and brilliantly successful. After occupying Agila with ease on March 24 and Mursa Briga, Kasr al-Baraka, on March 31, he resumed his advance on April 2, despite orders to stand still for 2 months, with 50 tanks backed by 2 new Italian divisions. The British evacuated Benghazi the next day and began a precipitate retreat into Egypt, losing great numbers of their tanks on the way. A large force of armor, surrounded at Mechelai, had to surrender on April 7. By April 11 all Cyrenaica except Tobruk had been reconquered by Rommel's audacious initiative. Tobruk, garrisoned mainly by the 9th Australian Division, held out against siege, and Rommel, though he defeated 2 British attempts to relieve the place, May and June 1941, was obliged to suspend his offensive on the Egyptian frontier, since he had overstretched his supply lines. Wavell, the success of whose North African strategy had been sacrificed to Churchill's recurrent fantasy of creating a Balkan front against Germany, Greece in 1941 was scarcely less disastrous for the British than the Dardanelles in 1915, nevertheless enjoyed one definitive triumph before Churchill, doubly chagrined at having lost Cyrenaica for Greece's sake and Greece for no advantage at all, removed him, in the summer of 1941, from his command in the Middle East. That triumph was the destruction of Italian East Africa and the elimination, thereby, of any threat to the Suez Canal from the south or to Kenya from the north. In August 1940 Italian forces mounted a full-scale offensive and overran British Somaliland. Wavell, however, was already assured of the collaboration of the former Ethiopian Emperor Haile Selassie in raising the Ethiopians in patriotic revolt against the Italians, and, whereas in June he had disposed only of meager resources against the 200,000 men and 325 aircraft under the Duca d'Aosta, Amadeo di Savoia, his troops in the Sudan were reinforced by 2 Indian divisions before the end of the year. After Haile Selassie and a British major, Ord Wingate, with 2 battalions of Ethiopian exiles, had crossed the Sudanese frontier directly into Ethiopia, General William Platt and the Indian divisions invaded Eritrea on January 19, 1941, the Italians had already abandoned Kassala, and, almost simultaneously, British troops from Kenya, under General Alan Cunningham, advanced into Italian Somaliland. Platt's drive eastward into Eritrea was checked on February 5, at Keren, where the best Italian troops, under General Michelangelo Carnimio, put up a stiff defense facilitated by a barrier of cliffs. But when Keren fell on March 26, Platt's way to Asmara, to Massawa, Mitsawa, and then from Eritrea southward into Ethiopia was comparatively easy. Meanwhile, Cunningham's troops were advancing northward into Ethiopia, and on April 6 they entered the Ethiopian capital, Addis Ababa. Finally, the Duca d'Aosta was caught between Platt's column and Cunningham's, and at Amba Alaji, on May 20, he and the main body of his forces surrendered. In 1940 Prince Abd al-Ilah, regent of Iraq for King Faisal, had a government divided within itself about the war. He himself and his foreign minister, Nuriaz said, were pro-British, but his prime minister, Rashid Ali al-Gilani, had pro-German leanings. Having resigned office in January 1941, Rashid Ali on April 3 seized power in Baghdad with help from some army officers and announced that the temporarily absent regent was deposed. The British, ostensibly exercising their right under the Anglo-Iraqi Treaty of 1930 to move troops across Iraqi territory, landed troops at Basra on April 19 and rejected Iraqi demands that these troops be sent on into Palestine before any further landings. Iraqi troops were then concentrated around the British air base at Abniyah, west of Baghdad, and on May 2 the British commander there opened hostilities, lest the Iraqis should attack first. Having won the upper hand at Abniyah and been reinforced from Palestine, the British troops from the air base marched on Baghdad. And on May 2 the British commander there opened hostilities, lest the Iraqis should attack first. Having won the upper hand at Abniyah and been reinforced from Palestine, the British troops from the air base marched on Baghdad, and on May 30 Rashid Ali and his friends took refuge in Iran. Abd al-Ilah was reinstated as regent, Nuri became prime minister, and a British military presence remained to uphold them.